do a quick intro. So I'm Joe Miller, live down in San Diego, and I am very involved right now with a PhD program in ethics. And this is a lot of the stuff that I want to talk to you guys about now. Just before I got here, though, into this level, I started out in my undergrad years at Penn State. I had a degree in architectural engineering, and then moved naturally, like flowed right into going to get my Master of Divinity in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then ended up doing pastoral ministry a bunch of years. Got a Doctor of Ministry degree, mostly on leadership development, church planting stuff. Over the years, I've done pastoral ministry for like 20 some years, and planted a couple churches over that time. And then I came down here to San Diego, ended up getting involved in higher ed. So I've been teaching at a seminary and working as a dean for online learning for the last about 8 years. In the midst of that, I said, hey, why not do more education? So I got a Master of Arts in Science and Religion, actually from the school that I was at. Did my thesis work in Hebrew cosmology, and then decided, why not do a PhD? So I started a PhD, like I said, in ethics. I'm out of Kansas City working at that. And and that's the focus of this stuff that I want to talk about to you guys tonight. So the kind of cool part is, and I know when Jane, like I said, wanted to make a dialogic, it was, this is a new presentation I'm working on. I'm in the middle of developing this argument and trying to sustain what I want to share with you guys. So I'm really excited to get your feedback, actually, too, and thoughts, because you may hear something differently than I'm intending to present it. The way I phrase it may not be as clear as I think it is. So this is actually a great opportunity for me to kind of hear what you guys have to say and as we go along. So I'm looking forward to that. All right. Any questions about that so far, just who I am or anything about my background? And while I pull up the slides. And
Where are you
Jane's going to
going
be
to
my
school right now?
moderator. So yeah, my PhD is through a place called Midwestern.
Okay.
And it's out of Kansas City, Missouri.
Where did you get the master's in science and religion?
So I was a part of a seminary down here in San Diego called Southern California Seminary. And so I did the MASR there.
Okay.
It's a little bit different than everyone knows the Biola one, which is usually, I think, a 32 unit master's. This one on here was like a 60 unit. It has a capstone thesis project. And that's why I ended up doing my thesis in Hebrew cosmology and creation and all that kind of stuff. So it was fun. Can anyone see that slide? Okay, good. By the way, like Jane's gonna raise, or she's gonna take questions in the chat for me, or if you guys are raising hands or whatever, I think she has it set up for. She's gonna moderate that. I have terrible eyesight anyway, so I wouldn't be able to see if you guys were doing anything anyway. So she'll do that, and you can see my cartoon me, which is far more handsome and never ages. So that's it. Although my old cartoon me used to have a goatee and more hair, so when I got older, I had to change them. So it was really interesting. I used to be fatter too. I was like 70 pounds heavier than I am now. So I was really cool because this is sort of like a prophetic cartoon. They don't let you make fat cartoon guys. So he was made skinny before I was. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, that's all aside. All right, let me, boom. All right. So let me just dive right into a couple things. I have a question for you guys. And I do want at least a couple people to give an answer. What do you think? Is racism a learned trait?
I would say yes.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone else think it can be learned, right?
What counts as racism in your framework?
Oh, that's a good question. What would you guys? I'll just throw it to you because what would you see as a definition of racism, or what do you think? What comes to mind at least, and then I'll tell you what I'm using it as.
I think at least one definition can be an indifference to an entire race having a disproportionate amount of harm done to them, economically, socially, politically.
Yeah.
I would say. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think racism, without defining in terms of the society as a whole, just look at it as individual level. It's actually a derivative of sin nature, which means I'm better than you. So if I think I'm better than you, that's pride. And pride, it's someone that I was born with. It could be pride about everything. The racism does not mean to be only regarding ethnicity, race. It could be other trait as well. But anything that has something to do with the concept of I'm better than you, that's racism.
One more, I think one more, somebody wanted to say something.
I was gonna say, just looking at another race as inferior and hating them.
Yeah, and I think all those are fair. I'll just sort of operatively just kind of say what I would say is racism is any, in this case, in this, for this question, I do think it's any individual can be a racist. Any individual can basically discriminate and or hate or treat others differently as inferior based on some sort of physical external characteristic. Usually is the way it works. So it could be skin color. It could be, gradations of skin color. It could be, facial features that are considered, of different, lower intelligence, or, ears or things like that. There's those things are connected usually with regions and places around the world. So I would say that's a fair way of just simply saying it. But that actually kind of leads to the next question, though, too, is there such a thing as institutionalized racism? So if we acknowledge that an individual can have feelings of bigotry or prejudice against others on a personal level based on something, and they can learn to hate, they could learn to dislike people based on, oh, we don't trust those kinds of people. Um, is there such a thing as institutionalized racism?
It seems like on those terms, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's controversial. I think it's unfortunate. I think a lot of people deny the sort of concept of institutionalized racism because I think they have maybe a political goal in mind, or they're worried it, fights for one political party over the other one. But I don't think there's any reason that Christians should shy away from the fact that, our individual racism can be turned into a corporate structure of some kind, whether it's a policy or a law or a practice that then takes what the individuals believe and creates a concrete expression of that through government or even a company or whatever. So the idea that racism can be, institutions can't be racist, but individuals who create them are, and I think they can create policies that are therefore racist. So here's where I'm going with this. So if the answer to these questions is yes, and I think we could agree so far that it is, then we must next answer the question, how? In other words, how is it learned? How do we end up turning our institutions, and institutionalize our learned patterns, or even if it's inborn, I'm not saying that it excludes like the idea of sin and inborn, but just take those learned patterns, for example, how do they become institutionalized and why? What causes that? And that's really the basis of my work that I'm trying to work on now. So what I'll say is our worldview creates one of three options when it deals with race, okay? So a worldview we have, and we'll define that in a second here maybe for just to ask a question on that. A worldview creates one of three options. It could either logically exclude racism, say, no, that's always wrong. A worldview could provide a logically coherent foundation that permits racism. So in other words, I could have a worldview in which I have a worldview that I personally may not have racist beliefs or practices, but the way I view the world doesn't prohibit or doesn't exclude, or creates even a logically coherent foundation for allowing people to believe that. And then the third one is it provides a logically coherent foundation that entails racism. In other words, I could have a worldview that you can't exclude the inescapable logic. Yes, this group has to be inferior to me for this XYZ reason. So whatever it is. So it seems to me those are the three basic options. So does anybody know what, or not know, or want to know, or have a definition, an easy one, quick, for what a worldview is or what I mean by that? Because I don't want to lose anybody at that point. Okay, okay. If no one's going to jump in, you guys are all gun shy at this point. But a worldview essentially is a way of organizing the observations in the world around us, organizing the facts, that tries to bring some sort of sense of understanding and connectivity to all those elements. And so we all have a worldview, a way of seeing everything around us. And then what we do is we tell stories. We say, oh, this is the way I connect all these observations of stuff. We take facts, we tell stories to make those facts connected, and that all coheres within a worldview. And so everybody has one, because that's how we try to make sense of, why does like this COVID stuff, why does this policy enacted by this governor, and why is this policy enacted by a different governor? Why do they have different policies? They're all faced with the same facts. Well, some people may deny facts, but it's not really a problem with the facts. Usually it's a problem with which facts we choose as valid, which ones we choose as not valid, and all that usually is connected to the way we view the world. So a worldview sort of sets that sense of, if you deal with it holistically, it tells us our origin, it tells us our meaning, it tells us our purpose, and it tells us our destiny. And those four elements are really a part of everybody's worldview. And worldview then can in this idea of, say, logically exclude, they can logically cohere and permit, or it can logically cohere and entail racism. Okay, so do those three options make sense to you guys? Everyone with me so far? Okay, good thumbs up. I see a
Yes.
couple of those. Great, thank
Yes.
you. So, and if you think of a fourth option, let me know, because I don't want to make any silly mistakes this early on. All right. So here's what I want to look at. So people have twisted both science and Christian theology of creation theories to justify and institutionalize racism. So we're going to talk a little bit about what I think it relates to the Darwinian view of evolution. And I'm specifically concerned with the idea of theistic evolution, the idea that somehow God guided this process. And I'm going to tie that, I think, historically to a lot of race issues. And we won't get into all of that today, and that's a lot of where my research is. It goes beyond today. But what I want to do is front end say, even though I'm critiquing that, this doesn't mean that science itself, the evolution science itself necessarily entails racism, or that creation itself entails it, even though there are some people that have views in their Christian theology that they use to justify their racism, and they use to institutionalize those things. So we could look at Christians in the past who have, said, oh, blacks shouldn't marry whites, and they have reasons, and they look at the Bible and the book of Acts and different verses and say, oh, therefore, people have their own domains, they shouldn't cross over. So people can abuse anything, okay? So I want to acknowledge that that's understood and a fair point from the beginning. So the other point is racism existed long before the time of Darwin, and it is possible, and is possibly not entailed by the neo-Darwinian theory, but racism is permitted. I say possibly not because I'm not convinced yet. It might actually be entailed. Racism, I think, may be entailed to some degree under Darwin's theory. He had concerns about that very thing, but I'm not convinced it's an absolutely entailed by it. So it is at least possible it is, but I think the real problem is that racism is permitted within that view. And so in contrast, what I want to say is that the Christian worldview, grounded in biblical creation, logically excludes racism and entails racial reconciliation. And I think that's a twofold thing that's really important. Because if we have a worldview that says, well, I shouldn't discriminate, it's bad to, be racist, right? That's different than saying I should treat everybody equally. In other words, one is a negative assertion, the other is a positive assertion. So I could say racism's bad, but can I say that I have it's necessary for me to love somebody who is different than me? I can say, okay, I shouldn't hate them, or I shouldn't have laws against them, but there's a difference between that and saying I should love them. And so those are two separate things that I think both of those are entailed by the Christian worldview of biblical creation. Okay, and so that's I'll summarize that argument a little bit, but I think the natural question that comes up is biblical creation, and I want to give a quick definition of what I mean when I say that, okay? But before I do that, any questions to this point about what you just saw on those slides, or anything not clear?
No, from
Good.
me, just speaking myself.
Great. That just affirms what an amazing teacher I am. Thank you. So I used to tell my students, I was like, because they didn't ask questions, I'm like, I have to use it as a point of vanity because nobody else will give me compliments, so I have to give them to myself.
Hey, Joe.
It's not because I'm prideful. It's because I just have no other outlet. Anyway.
Joe?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Chris. Hey, forgive me. I lost track of time. I showed up a little bit late, so I missed could you summarize in 60 seconds how we got to, we all agree that that racism is institutional?
We didn't spend a whole lot of time on that, but let me just say that we just talked about that individuals could be racist, and they have racist belief. It's not unreasonable that they would take those beliefs and enshrine them into things like laws or policy for a company they own, like no blacks can sit at the counter with the whites. Blacks right at the back of the bus, or certain government laws that might do that. So I think, I'm just picking some obvious ones. So the idea that we can turn our individual prejudices and racism into laws is all I mean by institutionalized racism at this point.
Okay.
Is that fair enough?
Are you saying that there's still currently institutionalized racism, or that was a thing of the past?
Yes, I actually believe there is, but I would maybe look at what counts as institutionalized racism differently. And I actually am glad you actually bring that up. That's actually one of those sticky questions that I think especially conservatives politically and sometimes Christians deny the institutionalized racism, but I'm meaning it, and we'll get to this, and I'll show you examples of what specifically I mean by it.
Okay.
I mean something quite different than, say, somebody who's coming from a worldview that's, say, a socialist neo-Marxist worldview, or a naturalist worldview generally. And those are a lot of loaded terms I'm throwing out there. But we can argue about what counts as institutionalized racism later. But I guess for the limited scope of what I'm saying is, if we apply our individual racial bigotries or prejudices to our policies or laws, then that is a form of institutionalized racism. Is that fair enough? I can't see everybody on my screen, so
yeah, I think it's fair enough. I just down the road maybe you could identify some as being current, because I don't see any.
That actually will be a part of this, and we'll get to that. So, and I know where you're coming from. I think in that there was a way. We'll get to it, and you can see if I help you persuade you that. So let me just give you a quick definition of what I mean by biblical creation, what I think is included in that, what is not. First, what I'm saying, my guiding assumptions here. Now, no one has to agree with me. I don't want to get into a debate about this necessarily, because that would really be a whole other time. I just want to kind of let you know where I'm coming from, and why I'm making the argument that I'm making, and why I think it works. So my first bit of thing that I will say is that I believe that Genesis 1 and 2 is God's revelation. I believe that God broke into the human experience, and he gave us knowledge about himself, and it's true and accurate knowledge about who he is, and where we began, and how we started, and how we came to be. And Genesis 1 and 2 is part of that revelation from God. I believe Genesis 1 and 2 is historical narrative, distinct from all other ancient Near East literature, and its essential qualities and similar only its accidental qualities. There's some philosophical terms in there that I won't really get into, but the point is that I think we can learn a lot from ancient Near East mythology, but there's parts that are similar to biblical creation, but in philosophy, what we call accidental property, it's a non-essential. In other words, if you have two creation stories and both say, hey, in the beginning, there's the surface of the deep. So there's water in Genesis 1, and you have this other, you have another ancient mythology, and you're talking about, oh, there's water in this creation story here. Oh, they both have water. Oh, look, they're the same story. Well, no, those aren't necessarily essential to the core of the story. So I think if you look at Genesis and its essential qualities, and what sets it apart that makes it different, not the parts that are similar, but what makes it different, it is unique from all these other ancient mythologies. Genesis 1 and 2 reveals an historically accurate account of human origins through God's special creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So I do believe in a historical, real Adam and Eve who were created sui genera. That means, without, they didn't have a prior form. They didn't evolve from something else. They're created by God originally as unique creations put into a garden, and that's where they lived. So I believe that's true. Genesis 1 and 2 is God's revelation of divine purpose, not scientific process. So this is an important one that everyone will talk about. And generally, there's some agreement on this, that even from the most young earth creationist to old earth creationist, most will acknowledge that it's not a scientific textbook per se. So it tells, I believe it gives us a real look at reality of where we came from, but it doesn't tell us the processes and the mechanisms that God used. Other than said, God said, and it happened. But, that's like saying I turned on the stove and the water boiled. Well, that's true, but it doesn't tell me the chemical process involved in heating and H2O and what happens at the molecular level. But it still doesn't mean it's wrong to say that I turned on the stove and I heated up water, right? So that's the distinction I would make in that thing. Any questions on this slide before I do the next one?
No.
Okay, good. Because this is the easy stuff. I mean, as far as just setting my viewpoint out. Jesus taught that Adam and Eve were the blueprint for the marriage covenant. So when we talk about this doctrine of creation, I want to look at some of how that's interpreted in the New Testament and used, this idea of historic Adam and Eve. So for Jesus, he's saying, look, here's Adam, here's Eve. They become this blueprint for marriage. In Matthew 19 is where I'm looking there. We can look at Paul. He taught that Jesus was the second Adam who saved humanity from the first Adam's fall. So I think we look at Paul and say he believed that there was a genuine connection in both what Adam's sin and the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. So if we're going to take Adam as fictional or mythological in the sense of non-real, then I think we have a problem with what Paul's understanding of Adam was. And then we go back to the point of revelation. Do we believe that Paul had knowledge that from God that is accurate and trustworthy? And that's my assumption. So that's what I would go with. So the hope of eternal resurrection is tied to God's creation of Adam and Eve as unique from all creation. So the idea of our future destiny. So remember, I talked about a worldview, talks about our origin, purpose, meaning, and destiny. And so when we look at this, we have origin in one, we have partly purpose and meaning in terms of marriage and procreation in two. We have a little bit of meaning, a little bit of purpose there that are sprinkled in. And now we're looking at destiny in this, where we're talking about resurrection, that there is an eternal life that we have. Well, according to that's tied to our belief in a historical Adam. And then through the second Adam, that is Jesus, humanity can be freed from the tyranny of racial animus that mars our culture. And that really gets to what I think purpose is. So I think in these four things, we get this idea of origin, meaning, purpose, and destiny from the scripture that tie that to the historical reality of Adam and Eve. So that's the framework I'm using to make my argument from. And again, I'm sure there's lots of potentially disagreement. I don't know everybody in this group, but I just kind of wanted to lay out why I think my argument works as far as why the doctrine of creation entails both a rejection of racism and the necessity of racial reconciliation. I think it ties into this doctrine. Okay, so any questions about what I'm defining as biblical creation, or anything I've left out that you might want me to address that you don't see in my discussion of that?
No, I think looks
Okay.
pretty good.
Okay, I will say this, nobody brought this up, but one of the things I didn't mention is age of the earth. I don't believe that, I'm sort of agnostic about. I think there's arguments for young earth, old earth. I studied, my seminary stuff that I did actually was I studied under a lot of young earth creationists, some of the leading young earth creationists. And I've read a lot of stuff of old earth creationists. I'm not persuaded that one has to be, that the Bible has a direct thing to say about young earth or the age. I think there are arguments that can be there. So I'm sort of, that part of whether it's old or young is, at least to this argument, I think is neutral to the historical Adam and Eve. You don't have to be an old earth or a young earth people. Both of those people agree on the historicity of Adam and Eve, largely. And so that's to me is just a non-issue. So I don't include it in my definition because I just don't think it's critical to making the argument. So I think I respect people who hold both opinions, and so that's where I'm at. So this is the summary of the argument that I make. So the biblical revelation of the historical Adam and Eve, created as sacred beings in God's image, as the designed progenitors, that means the actual mom and dad of all mankind, provides the most coherent axiological, that is a metaphysical reality, an ethical, this defines the coherent ethical reality that exists outside of culture. So the most coherent axiological foundation for knowing racial bigotry is objectively evil, and the biological justification for rejecting the socio-political dehumanization of racial groups endemic to these historical alternatives that I'm about to kind of give out to you guys. So that's sort of the operative argument that I want to make and defend a little bit to you guys tonight. Okay. So that sort of summarized what I had earlier, but it's just in one page and written down. Anything not clear in that for you guys, or any words that I need to work on or define for you here?
I wonder exactly about the sort of, I wonder if you have a strong definition of like logically like possible, impossible. Is that going to be relevant to this? It feels like really strong to say that something is
Sure.
logically impossible.
Yeah, so I wouldn't deal with logic. Well, you can get into when somebody says logically possible, impossible. We get into things like ontology and epistemology, and if you've read any of, are you thinking of? Why am I trying to like? Who's the guy that really does a lot on that? Are you thinking of a particular author? I'm trying to blank all of a sudden.
No, I just my
Okay.
own working definition of like logically impossible is that like something like it's impossible for X and not X to obtain at the exact same time. Like it's literally, it's extremely strong. It's the strongest form of impossibility. So I didn't know if you were using that in more of a technical sense, or just saying that.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, okay.
Do I have? Did I use possibility? Where did I? I mean, on this slide, I was just looking if I used that particular phraseology. I didn't think I did. So I'm using cohere, not logical possibility or probability. So because that would get to evaluating certain elements of these theories that I'm not going to broach. I'm not. We may come up with that. I guess that's a good question. Maybe as I go, we bring that back if it comes up, and when I get into looking at these other alternatives. But I guess more important to me is that, does the argument, the way we view the world, does it provide a consistently coherent foundation for us to either reject racism and or promote racial reconciliation? So if we got into the possibility that an individual, or the probability who held that system might be a racist or do that thing, that would be a whole different, that'd be a whole different study, I guess is my point. So I don't think your question will impact this discussion. I don't think, but
Cool.
this is what I'm here to learn with you guys. No, that's a great question. I like it. I just don't think it connects. So, but if you find it, let me know. So what I want to look at then is biblical creation and modern, not scientific, but historical alternatives. And that's something critical that I want to look at. So when I'm talking in the coming slides about Darwinian evolution, or what I'll sometimes refer to as neo-Darwinian theory, what I want to argue and point out is I'm not talking about the science of what biology or those sort of things tell us. What I'm talking about is when Darwin is used through the framework of a naturalistic assumption, that is, that there is no God, there is no creation, we all came by natural means to exist, right? So there isn't a divine intervention at that point. So that's a worldview assumption, and that's not something you can prove scientifically. That's philosophy, that's not science. And so I guess I like this quote, actually. I'd recommend to you guys. It's really interesting. A guy named Mortimer Adler. Does anyone know who Adler is?
Yes.
I don't.
Who is he? Come on.
How to read a book.
Yes, he does How to Read a Book. Yeah, that's a cheap one. I think that's the one I have. I don't know. Is that what I have? No, no, I have his different book there. He's the editor, compiler of all the great books of the Western world. All those volumes. How to Read a Book. Everybody does reads that book from him. There's a lot of other books that he did. But most of his life, he was an atheist, rejected God. And he came to Christ late in his life after he actually did all the work on the great books. And so I like this quote from him because I think he's a pretty solid thinker. So in the 1930s, he was still an atheist at that point, an atheist philosopher. Adler made this observation. He said, evolution is not a scientific fact, but at best a probable history, a probable history, a history from which the evidence is insufficient and conflicting. So I would think actually maybe it's better to use possible as opposed to probable. That goes back to your question earlier. But I think his main point is this. He's saying, hey, it's possible. It's maybe even probable, depending on how you want to find that. But he's saying, look, it's just it's a historical, it's a way of looking at history and creating a story that connects the information. Because remember what I talked about a worldview? And if you ever read N.T. Wright, he talks about this. So a worldview is that framework we use to say, here's how I'm going to see the world. Stories are the things we tell ourselves that make sense of that worldview. And then we take facts and information, and usually we filter those based on our worldview, but then we connect them to our story. Okay, and so we craft those things, worldview, story, and facts, to sort of make the way we make arguments, right? And so what Mortimer is saying here is actually pretty brilliant. He's saying, look, evolution is not a scientific fact. There's scientific evidences, but the idea of evolution itself is really a historical story we're telling ourselves of how this evidence fits together. And he's saying that the story doesn't work. The story doesn't fit. And so that's the level I sort of want to approach this at today, not at the molecular biology and doing all the kind of that sort of sciencey kind of stuff, but at the level of story. Is that fair for you guys? Are you still following on that, and understand how I'm using the idea of evolution in this argument? Any pushbacks? Okay. You'll be wrong.
Yeah, so far so good.
Oh man. All right. So what I want to look at then is 4 possible histories. Okay, what are the 4 possible historical alternatives? And these are the 4 that I boiled it down to in my research over the last bunch of years, the last 4 or 5 years. So we have this idea of what's called theistic polygenism. A guy named Louis Agassiz back in the 19th century held this view. The short version is that everybody originated from different things. So as a creation view, this would be a theistic view of God. Some Christians would have held this, but they believe that in point of fact, so white people and Asian people and black people in Africa, 6 general races that they observed in the world. And they said each of these was created by God, but they were created separately in many of these cases. Or some had a sort of evolutionary view that said each of them evolved is independent and separate races that they shouldn't intermix. And so there was a lot of theists who used God in this idea to explain the separate origins of the races. Then there's the atheist polygenism of a guy who's unfortunately named, or appropriately named, depending on how you look at, Carlton S. Kuhn. And he was a guy who was like I said, a non-theist who believed those same kind of things. He wouldn't put God in the mix, but believed there was different origins, okay, for the races biologically, that there was a biological component to race that made, these races have separate origins in the sort of history of evolution. But without getting too far into the weeds in that, I think the common ground for the polygenists was the assumption that all human races originate from distinct sets of ancestors. So they all have different ancestral origins. Whether those ancestors were created by God or evolved, they still all believed that all different races had different ancestral origins. And the polygynists like Agassiz and Kuhn graded humans as lower or higher by distinctive biological heritage. So you could, the whites were on one scale, blacks or Asians or Mongols, whereas another group, they had, like I said, there were 6 of them generally that were accepted. and they said, okay, we're going to grade this group based on these sort of biological features of, phenotypical features means stuff on the outside. So the slope of the forehead, or, the size of ears, believe it or not, was used in many of these cases. Poverty was actually considered a biologically inherited trait that you were bound, they're doomed to it by your heritage. So therefore, people who are poor, it's because of their inferior biological heritage. There's all kinds of things that kind of came in there. But those were the two common views, regardless of whether they blamed God or evolution for it. That's the way they kind of viewed it. Okay. And then the other two views really were a little different. They were atheistic monogenism. A guy like William King in the 19th century held this view. And that's basically that everybody had, this is more what we'd think today. Darwin would fall into this camp of atheistic monogenism, where it's this idea that everybody, there is one, ultimately universal common ancestor, that all the species, all the diversity we see today eventually at one point began at one little tiny little microbe, and then it changed and morphed, and different things happened through natural selection. All those and boom, and eventually we have all the diversity we see through all these changes that take place. And so then we get the theistic monogenism by a guy named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic priest, also a scientist. And so he had a sort of put God into the mix, but he essentially had the same view. So this is the common ground here again. I want to focus on these common ground points, because I think this is why we get to this idea of what a worldview logically maybe includes. It may not entail, but opens you up to, whether you like it or not, is these commonalities. So the common ground for the monogenists was the assumption that all human races originated from a common ancestral group, which we talked about. And then also monogenists like King and Teilhard graded humans lower or higher by degree of evolved perfection. So it wasn't based on their biological origins, but by their degree. So somebody was lower on the evolutionary scale or higher on the evolutionary scale. And that is inescapable in Darwinian evolution, whether you're a theist or a non-theist. There always has to be a lower evolved form and a higher evolved form. And people, I think, try to get around from it. There's arguments of differently evolved, because, well, it's not better or worse, it's just more appropriate to the environment. But it's still, I think you're bound to this idea that if a certain trait evolved because it's going to survive in a particular environment, then by definition that evolved form has to be valued as some degree higher or more valuable to the society. So there's no way to really, I think, get away from that problem when people try to do that. So those are the commonalities there. So on those four groups, you guys, does that make sense what those are, or any thoughts on those things? My dad's trying to call me.
A question about the monogenous.
Yes.
So the theistic monogism, they also used evolution for.
Yes.
So there was there a group that was theistic monogenism that did not use evolution?
No, there's no theistic monogenists who did not use evolution that I would be aware of. This particular view, unlike the theistic polygenists, there are some that believed in a special creation for each race that would have rejected evolution. They're sort of an outlier, a very minor view, but they still ended up racially discriminating. So it's a flawed view from the jump. But yeah, all the other three views all embrace some form of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Yeah. Good question.
Are you essentially saying that, with this idea of evolution, that in that worldview of evolution, there can be some races or other races that may be more advanced due to evolution than others. So therefore, maybe evolution is promoting more racism than not.
Yeah, I think evolution does ultimately, I think it institutionalized, and this is where that word institutionalism comes, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I think where I'm at now in my study is I think it's kind of almost inescapable that the worldview at least minimally allows for somebody to have that, and the only way to get away
Possibility.
from that is to, it allows for the possibility, and you can't get away from it except by making a case of special pleading. So Christians will say, well, I know it's still wrong because the Bible says this or that, but my problem with that is, but you're still embracing a worldview that I think is opposed to what I think the biblical worldview is. So I think that creates a problem, and I'll kind of get into that later a little bit. But that's a good thinking ahead question, though. That makes
I've
sense.
never thought about that.
Yeah.
Like now that you were talking about that, I never, but that is true. So I never thought. So that's kind of like, I was like, wow, like kind of like a light bulb in my head. I was like, that is true. That possibility. So yeah, that definitely is interesting.
Yeah, this is what's driven me for the last like 4 or 5 years, really. And that argument I put on the other slide, that took me several years just to even try to think of how to put that together without making myself make any, being silly. I mean, it's taken a long time to try to put this together because it's not really looked at in this way. So, so it's kind of been fun to look at. So I'm glad to be, like I said, it's fun to do this with you guys. It really is. So let me just go on to this slide. And again, if I'm not seeing, raise a hand. Jane's doing that. Jane can interrupt anytime. If you have comments in there, you can even type in your questions or comments, and she can bring them in whenever she thinks that's appropriate. So I really, keep engaging here. Even if I don't pause, if I lose you on one of these slides, feel free to jump in or type a question, and Jane will figure it out. Okay. So this is what I want to look at, this idea of a worldview that I think is coherent in allowing us and ultimately, I think, institutionalizing racism. So Darwin did not believe blacks were necessarily a unique species, because the funny part about it is the origin of the species. He never actually defines what species is. He says it really can't figure it out. And he never really answers the question that's in the title. But he did use the term subspecies and mongrel populations to describe crossbreeding between blacks and white Europeans. So he did do that. Now, Darwin was opposed to the institution of slavery. He didn't like it. He was appalled by it. He thought it should not be allowed. But he feared that he actually feared, and he wrote about this, he was afraid that his theory would be used by those who were in support of slavery to keep blacks in slavery. But he didn't see a way out of this. See, this is what got me thinking about this originally, is he didn't see a way around that within his argument for evolution, that you could get away from dehumanizing blacks, because he recognized, in his view, they were still lower on the evolutionary scale. He just didn't like the institution. He had a personal bias against it, but there's nothing in his worldview that said it's wrong. Okay, that was his problem that he struggled with. In The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin assured his readers, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man," in context he means Caucasian races, "will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races," that is, Negro races, throughout the world. So this was not a lamentable thing necessarily. Although he hated the institution of racism, he realized that the whites were a superior evolved form of humanity. And even if blacks weren't, even if they were a subhuman, even if they weren't, even if they were still closer to the apes than they were to the white Europeans. And so that by just the laws of evolution, eventually they will be exterminated. And that's the way of evolution. The superior species, eventually eliminates the inferior species. So that was part of his theory and thinking. Is that shocking to any of you guys? I mean, have you heard those things talked about, what Darwin wrote in that? Or no? You guys have heard those things?
I never really heard those quotes, but it all seemed to be logical according to his theory.
Yeah, he's an interesting read for sure. So I want to look at this quote from
which made the Third Reich, a logical outcome.
It was, I think, and that, I don't want to usually go there. Matter of fact, I don't go there in my stuff because it's too incendiary. It's just sort of, everyone throw the Nazi flag, but there is some actually good stuff. There's a Harvard law professor that wrote a book recently, not a believer, but talked about the origins of the legal policies in Germany were tied to the eugenists in the United States who were beholden to Darwin. Now, he doesn't mention Darwin in his work. He just looks at the law. But if you look at who wrote the laws and where they came from, it's all tied to Darwin. So it's really actually, I think, it's a pretty rock solid argument in the end, where that Darwin was the motivating worldview behind a lot of the Nazi program. But that's sort of another thing outside this.
I think when he originally wrote his article, he did include that kind of thinking into his book, like the previously quoted, the descending of humans. But
yeah,
later on, I think it was way too much politically incorrect thing, and in London they attempted to remove or to cover up, and even today a lot of colleges teaches evolution, Darwinianism, but that part of a dark history is all cover up. That's why young people don't even know, because it's such contrary to the current culture thinking.
Yeah, there's a distinction that's made oftentimes between the science of Darwin and the social Darwinism that they'll call, that they say that's the reason we got into the racial stuff that happened. But that's a false dichotomy. It's a false distinction. It works, if you aren't really looking at the evidence, but that distinction doesn't exist. I can't prove that to you guys here today. You'll just have to take my word for it. But really, that distinction doesn't exist. But I'll give you a couple examples I think that illustrate that. But that's true. It's been tried to shield the quote unquote science of Darwin from the worldview of Darwin, and you can't do it. It's just not really possible, I don't think. This is a guy named William King. Actually, this not a good dude. He wrote the Neanderthal skulls an eloquent oval form with a basal outline bearing much resemblance to that of the Negro cranium. It is of large size, being about an inch longer than the ordinary British skulls. So the reason I include this quote, because this is a typical Darwinian worldview that the Neanderthals were pre-hominids. They were before the actual evolved Homo erectus, and they were lower on the evolutionary scale. That view is no longer accepted today, but that was the common view then. But what they did was they took these, what I said, phenotypical features, which are not biological features because they didn't even understand biology then, but they took the sloped foreheads, the jaw structure, and said these are features common to blacks in Africa and the Australian Aborigines. Therefore, we can see that these features represent lower evolved forms. And this is, again, evidence of evolution, of how they looked at it. Now we think, okay, that's a long time ago. That can't be the way it is, but I want to tie that and why I picked this line of argument to kind of make the case. So here's a typical, I have dozens of these things that I've collected over time. Our face from fish to man is one. See, we start out in fish and we work our way up to lizards and then lemurs and then other apes and other orangutans, apes, chimpanzees. But look on the evolutionary scale, which is lower here on the evolutionary scale. This actually, I'm pretty sure that actually a gal, I can't think of her name right now. I think they actually used her face. She looks familiar, but it's very similar to a guy who's an Australian Aborigine. But all of these things, if you see longer forms of these charts, it would, between the monkey would usually be somebody who's African descent, and then up above that they'd have somebody who's usually Asian, and then above that you have all these different racial groups up until you get the white European, usually Northern European. It's even Southern European, and some of the Western Europeans were also considered lower evolved. So not all whites were excluded or included in this highest form. This came to example in 1901. This is a guy named Otto Benga. He was actually a pygmy brought over from Africa by a guy who used to be a Christian missionary, but he brought over him as a pygmy, and he was put on display at the St. Louis World's Fair, but also then ultimately he was held in the ape cage at the Bronx Zoo in New York City, and he was displayed there for a long period of time. Now, that's not a one-off. The guy who was the curator for the Bronx Zoo, and the guy that was in charge of that, he was a part of all the federal parks program stuff. He was informing the president at the time. These guys were his viewpoints, putting him here as a representative of the lower evolved Africans, was backed by all the science of the day. This was not a one-off thing. And I put this article up there. It's interesting. They're talking about here, these are newspaper articles at the time talking about this guy who's the missing link. Here's Darwin's missing link, and you can come see him at the zoo. And this is one I really have an interest in. So this tells the story of basically the zookeeper was using a hosing down Otobenga to like he would an animal, and the reporter says, "Oh, Otobenga, you could see him get incensed and outraged at just being hosed down." And he's like, this shows basically why these lower evolved Africans don't understand advanced humor and the jesting and the cultural things of white Europeans, essentially. So as an aside, this is part of the history why if somebody who's not black says to a black person, you're crazy or you're nuts or you're out of control, they may take that as a racial offense. And it's not because what you're saying is one. It's because there is a history that looked as blacks, because they were lower, they didn't have the emotional control that white people had. They couldn't use reason like white people did. So there's a history of how those kinds of phrases were used against blacks in just sort of the common understanding within this Darwinian worldview. And that was, so again, that's why those things can be sensitive today. Any questions on this stuff?
I had a question. So my mind is like so blown right now. Like I did not expect to be learning about this, but my mind is so mind blown right now. But this brought up when I was thinking of Hitler, and when his idea of trying to exterminate the Jews and his belief in evolution. And so looking at this, I can see how just his way of thinking is it basically like promoting it's more of a comment, but it's like kind of just promoting what he believed in. And I was watching in a movie where it was like back in the time of slavery, where there was this white man, and he was talking about slaves, and he was saying was that black people in the field, that they don't feel the heat as much as Caucasian men. And so I was just thinking about that now, like looking at this, I can see how like it's just crazy. It's just mind blowing right now. Just how kind of for me, it's connecting a lot more to what I've seen and what I've learned in the past.
Yeah, good.
Hey,
awesome.
Joe, have you connected any of this to Margaret Sanger and her desire to eliminate the black population?
That's a good point. Wow.
I have dozens of slides. We could go into the eugenics movement. I couldn't do it today for you guys, but I've got tons of stuff. Yes, the eugenics movement in the early 19th or the early 20th century, Margaret Sanger, her views, all of these are tied to this Darwinian worldview. I wanted to, and so, yeah, I mean, the case of that, Richard Cart's blog on that, you can kind of Google his name or hit me up after. I'll get you some of his stuff. He's done a lot tying it to Hitler. He's done work specifically in those areas a lot. And but there is some good research in those areas for sure.
I had just a point to try and give you a little pushback. If maybe, I don't know if you're going to get into this in a little bit. One thing I was wondering is, like, I mean, for the most part, like, and I've heard this from a lot of people that have like studied Nietzsche and a lot of like Mein Kampf for Hitler, any of the other sort of like outworkings that you're kind of gesturing towards. If that's the case, I mean, then why did a lot of that disappear in modern academia? Is it because of something specifically? Because I don't think that like most people would be aboard by this, but
no,
not that it disappeared, but let me rephrase it then. Like, why is, if this is a logical sort of connection between these sorts of things, then why is that not something that people would espouse? At least maybe not out loud, or maybe they wouldn't make that connection.
So there's an escape hatch that the Darwinians used basically into the 1960s. It wasn't really to the 1960s that they sort of came up with this idea. And you can see actually Kuhn was a guy I mentioned earlier who argued with a guy named Dobronsky, who was he was a physicist mostly, but Kuhn had this view of, biological traits, race is biological. Once once Hitler came out and they realized, oh my gosh, this is exactly what the eugenists here. I mean, the writings of the eugenists in the United States. Now, eugenics, I don't have time to really get into that, but there was a group of people who basically tried to purify the race, the human race, not necessarily black or white, but just the human race, through breeding and making sure you married, and you don't want rich people marrying poor people and stuff like that. Matter of fact, I don't want to get, I'm going to sidetrack myself. I want to stay focused on your question because it's good, but I get excited because there's so many little pieces that connect this. But what happened is you have a guy like Kuhn who was basically ousted, even though I think the science was better on his side from the Darwinian perspective, to say that there are biological distinctives, in terms of what make up black, white, Asian and stuff. But see, for them to acknowledge that there's biological distinctives entailed the idea inescapably that there had to be inferior and superior people. See, from a Christian worldview, that isn't entailed, because I can have biological distinction without sacrificing the equality and human sacredness of the individual. That viewpoint is not entailed by a biological distinction, but it is entailed. That specific view is entailed. This is why I think it may be entailed as this particular point, and I'd have to really do it. But I think it may be truly, truly entailed and inescapable if you have a neo-Darwinian worldview, I think. But so what they did is have this fight in the 60s because they realized what this led to in Europe. And the eugenists in the United States is funny because people like Margaret Sanger and others wrote in you can read in their papers, they said, look, we can't promote this anymore. Look what it turned into. We have to become much more tricky in this. So they started to say race was a cultural construct. So they said that there is no such thing as race. Race isn't biological. It's a cultural construct. So that language that if you look at any sociology book today, they say race is a social construct. Why do we say that? Well, we said that only because we were trying to escape what happened when we accepted Darwin's worldview. So it's basically, it's a kludge. It's something that was brought in to get rid of, I don't like where my viewpoint is logically, coherently taking me. I need an escape hatch. So they created the escape hatch of, race as a cultural construct, because they couldn't abandon the idea of purely natural origins, because they didn't want to allow for a God to come into they can't allow for God to come into the theory if they deny God exists. That's why within that worldview, that's how that works. Does that make sense? That I kind of answer it as shortly as I can? Because again, I get excited, and so I don't. There's so much.
Yeah. I have some follow-ups, but I'd rather hear the rest of your presentation. I can wait till Q&A. We'll see if we can
write them down. Don't forget them, please. I want to hear the follow-ups because this is important to me to hear what you guys are thinking at these moments.
I was going to say just really quick, on Otabanga, there's quite a few quality documentaries out there that go more in depth into his life and his later suicide and things like that. It's a horrible story.
I think the gal that wrote the book on that, they turned it into the Discovery Institute, I think, was involved with that. And you can watch it on YouTube. You can watch it on YouTube. Yeah, I've seen it. It's one of the reasons I use it, because there's so many good materials about it that you can follow up with it. So it's a great illustration to use because there's materials you guys can follow up on if you Google that name, for sure.
Hey, Joe, what'd you think about the, I don't know what it is. It's an article or anyway, James Watson's view on intelligence and race.
Yeah, Watson, for people who don't know, is of course the discoverer of, this idea of DNA and all that we view in the modern idea of genetics, right? Watson and Crick. But Watson was of course he was a racist and a sexist, but so was everybody in his day. Watson's problem is not that he had racist views. The problem is that those views are no longer acceptable publicly. But he always had those views. Watson never changed. Crick never changed. He's always the same guy he was. if anything, honestly, I feel bad for the dude because I think he's at an advanced age. I don't think he even understands why he, had his name removed from things. I just don't think he's at the age that he gets it. And not that I feel bad that he's a racist, but I just feel bad that an old dude, he just doesn't understand where the world moved. But the problem that people don't. Go ahead.
Is the research valid?
Well, that's a biological question. Actually, the truth is that the idea that DNA determines the DNA is as determinative as we think it is actually in doubt right now. Anyway, the idea that your DNA determines your structures, because there's a thing called epigenetics, horizontal gene transfer that are being dealt with in the field of geneticists and biologists are dealing with, and we're realizing that DNA isn't as quite as programmatic as we had once thought. So there might be problems with it, but it's not based on, this view of race. I mean, it doesn't connect to this directly. But his view may be wrong, but not for any of those particular reasons dealing with its race or anything, if that makes sense.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
You talked about a book on eugenics earlier. Can you give us the title and the author?
Richard Weikart, I'll give you his name. His one book is From Darwin to Hitler. You'll want to take a look at. And I am drawing a blank on the, I could look it up in a second, but if you want the one by a Harvard professor, Jane, send me a note after, remind me, and I'll give you guys the title of that book that he ties the American eugenics, the laws in the United States to the laws of Nazi Germany. He doesn't acknowledge the Darwinian side, but he doesn't have to, because everybody else, like guys like Weikart, have made that connection. So he actually doesn't even know that he helped make that argument really clear, that Hitler was a product of Darwinian thinking. So I'm going to give you guys a quick aside because I can't resist this one, because I just want to blow your mind with a thought. I'm not going to back it up. I'm just going to say it so you guys get freaked out and then think it's awesome. And then, so the idea, I did a whole show. I do a show almost weekly. I took some time off, called Off the Cuff. Jane's been on. We're going to have her on this Saturday. But I do with a guy named Leroy Hill. We've done this. And we talk about the idea of, FDR's, Great Society, and the idea of the whole program he built for helping people in poverty, right? We think that's a great thing today. But that whole program was racist in its origins. It wasn't meant to help people who were Black. It was meant to keep them down. It was meant to oppress them. And here's why, the short answer that's really important, because it ties to all these things. Because this is what the eugenists have done. And this goes back to the question, why don't we see it today? We do. It's just so underground in our thinking that we don't even see that it's in front of us. The most virulent, and I use that word intentionally, even though it's a viral word, the most virulent supporters of the Great Society and using all this, what am I drawing blank? What do you give people when they're unemployed? What is it? Why can't I think of the word? Welfare system. The welfare state. Yeah. The strongest support of that were the racists, monogenists and polygenists in the South. Kuhn, I showed you before, all these guys were strong. His cousin was one of the leaders in the South. Kuhn was quiet about it, but he was helping inform through his stuff these racist, white nationalist type groups in the South. But they were the strongest supporters of giving this aid. You know why? Because if you can control where the money comes from, you can also control where they live. And the eugenists were big about making sure that the races didn't intermix. So if you can say, hey, we're going to give you a house. Is it because we love you? Oh, sure, it's because we love you. We want to care for you. But in truth, it's because we want to put Black people in a inner city where they don't have to mix with white people, because we can put them in their cities out of compassion. And then we can we can just keep them separate. So, in the mid 20th century, there's 35 states that had laws against intermarriage between Blacks and whites. But as those fell out of favor, when we realized what Hitler had done, they moved to things like the welfare state to compassionately institutionalize the systems of racism that have been building since Darwin's day. And that goes back to the idea of institutionalized racism that I want to bring out. That's where I think it's institutionalized. Let me give you this other quick example on the slide, and then I'll take any thoughts. So this is this actually comes from a website that's current. It's, I think, the British Museum. I can't remember exactly which one this comes from, the British Museum. And it shows basically a typical story, the story, not the science, the story of evolution. We start with ape man, it diverges into early humans, and then there's early humans in Asia and Africa. Already we can see that there's different strains. This is still technically monogenism, but we see different evolutionary strains. And then look at what happens. You have the early in Africa, then they get into modern human, Homo sapiens. And then at the bottom, we have the Hobbit, which is in evolutionary theory, for the most part, a lower evolved form of a pre-hominid, non-human. Some theorize that it's a devolved person of modern humans. In other words, it's humans, because they were isolated on an island, they didn't have good nutrition, they devolved, they lost their sort of traits. What do you notice, though, about the modern human, the facial features, the characteristics of the modern human, and the lower human, the early humans, the Hobbit humans?
The skin color?
Yeah, skin color. Now tell me, what scientific find do we have skin color available to us? What dig has given us the skin color of any early skeletal form that we find?
No, I don't know.
None.
Iceman?
None.
None. These are all, you can read books, and Weikart has this in his books. Lots of people have it. These are all fictionalized artistic renderings. And these are all tied to Darwin's view that on the evolutionary scale, the Africanized features were lower on the evolutionary scale. And here's an example, current example. So this picture I have on the right there, this you see it looks like a person, a black male, an African person. That's actually an early depiction of Neanderthal man. That is an older picture. Okay, very Africanized features, the broad nose, the longer forehead, the dark skin, right? But this is when the theory of Neanderthal man is that they were pre-humans. But now the evidence is pretty clear that they had intelligence, that we have genetic studies that are telling us that, anywhere from a couple percent to 6% of every European has Neanderthal blood. So that means they could interbreed. So if they could interbreed, they're the same species. So they couldn't have been pre-hominids. They had to be, some form of human. Guess what that picture is on the bottom? That's a computer somebody did a computerized current one, and this is on science websites, of what they think, Neanderthal, they could walk among us. They could be on the red carpet. They could be anywhere. So that's what they say a Neanderthal looks like now. Well, wait a second. How is it that Neanderthals, now that they're intelligent and human, become more European in their features? She has lighter skin, less Africanized features, more European, sort of certainly transitional, but certainly less than the Neanderthal man we see above that's brutish and African in his features, right? So this is what I mean by institutionalized racism. We can look at this in biology textbooks, and we can look at it at science museums. The more we say that a early human form, pre-human form is closer to humanity, they become more European in their features. The more that we say they're closer to the apes, the more Africanized, or even, Asian, again, are still lower, but they're usually transitional in their form. You could look at that look at the Asian guy at the bottom there. He's still considered a lower form. So that's what I kind of want to get out on that slide. So any thoughts or questions about that?
This is crazy.
Yeah, that's what I think. It's wild.
The Asian don't have that many hairs.
Yeah. So here's the thing. And I mean, again, if somebody has a question, please type it, interrupt. I just want to get through a couple more of these slides. And I mean, because I want you guys to see the framework of this argument. So Ernst Haeckel proposed the name Homo stupidus for Neanderthals, right? So I'm only using tonight this idea of Neanderthal because we can see that there's a transition in the quote unquote science of Neanderthals when they were pre to when they're humans, lower on the evolutionary scale, missing links to, Africans are missing links on the scale, this sort of progression, right? Lower to higher. That's what monogenists do, which is the dominant view today. Almost nobody is really a polygenist. And if they are, so monogenism is the only thing today. So whether you're a theist or an atheist, that's the view that you take of human origins. There's lower form to higher forms were different on the evolutionary scale. So Ernst Haeckel proposed the name Homo stupidus for the Neanderthal, saying because how dumb they were, based again, not on the science, but based on how he needed these missing links. So in 1926, Haeckel approved of Bernoulli Moen's experiment in France to use Negro sperm, as he called it, to impregnate a chimpanzee, believing these lower, quote unquote, lower forms can inbreed with apes. So since the very beginning of the 20th century, this is really critical. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the most rabid Darwinists believed that the way they could prove their case of evolution, and don't misunderstand, their purpose in finding the missing link was so that they could put to bed any idea of a special creation that nutty anti-science Christians believed in. They're very clear about that. Christianity was the enemy of evolution. Christianity was the enemy of eugenics, and it needed to be stamped out. And if they couldn't co-opt the theists and the Christians to believe it, they needed to silence them. And they're very clear in the literature on this. They needed to have this proof. And so the idea was to take the sperm, and this is actually there is actually breeding experiments where they tried to get Black people to mate with apes, and women were allowed to be used in certain ways that we won't mention, because this is what science said we could do. It's appalling. So, but here's what he says. So he approved of this Darwin's bulldog, Darwin's biggest supporter, approved of this experiment in France, that the idea, let's just do these scientific experiments. If we can prove that the Negro can produce some offspring with an ape, we know that they can interbreed. Therefore, we know that they're these missing lower on the evolutionary scale forms. We think, oh, well, nobody does this today. Thus comes Richard Dawkins. Oh, the gift that keeps on giving. So he says that the dream of creating a human-chimp hybrid is not dead. Now, he doesn't talk about Blacks, but he does talk about humans. Now, because he knows it's not politically correct, but it's the same experiment today as, Bernoulli did, as Haeckel promoted, and that actually the Germans did as well. The Nazis did. It's the dream of creating the human-chimp hybrid, and it's not dead, he says. He says that this, in his 2009 article, Richard Dawkins argued this chimera, the mix of, this genetic mix of human and ape, would be a death blow to the Christian speciesist ethics. That is the idea that humans are unique and special, that values humans above other animals. And that is exactly what he believes. We have to do this to disprove Christianity and the foolish idea that humans are exceptional beings that have some sort of transcendent worth. And he's not alone. So here's this guy, David Barish. He challenged science in 2018. There was a sort of a question to commemorate, he said, to commemorate the bicentennial of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. He wanted to create that by creating a viable in-between what he called a humanzee or a chimpanzee human that would destroy what he considered the nonsensical deception of special creation by God and subsequent notions of soulish human exceptionalism. Now, what I don't have on this slide for you is really interesting. I have a piece of Nazi propaganda. It actually was used in their schools, but it was also used as a training thing. And they asked this question: does the same soul dwell in these people? And on one side, they had this sort of, ideal German, white, blonde, blue-eyed, white hair, blonde hair kind of thing. And on the other side, they had an African and they had an Australian Aborigine. And they asked the question, does the same soul, could God have possibly put the same soul into these people? Because they were using religious language to let religious people, they wanted to co-opt them too. There's no way that these inferior biologically human beings could have the same soul, the same value. So that's the goal all along, is to make this worldview match in this idea. So this idea of, proving the missing link, showing that Blacks are this lower evolved form, hasn't disappeared. It's just taken on a more culturally sensitive. Now we just talk about humans, but again, it's the same program. And you can't escape that. That is its purpose. All right. I want to pause there and kind of get a few thoughts from you guys.
It's interesting that, they were having this idea that blue eye, blonde hair, when blue eye is a mutation for having blue eyes. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and Hitler didn't. So, there's exceptions. But the bigger point of that is actually, and this is important to remember, that racism isn't just white, Black, Asian, whatever. There's white on white, there's Black on Black. And these same sort of idea of using phenotypical, the external features to discriminate have marked every society. So you can go to the places in Africa where if you are, there are tribes that have different skin color, and if you are the wrong skin color, they will kill you because that's bad. I remember when Barack Obama ran for president, and there was articles. I have clippings of the articles in, like, I think it was Ebony magazine, that said, he's a light-skinned black. He doesn't know, he's not a real genuine black guy because he grew up he had a white mom. He's biracial. He grew up in Hawaii. He's not an authentic black person, but he didn't have the right skin color for many people. This is not uncommon. The show I do with my friend Leroy Hill, he can tell you, man, he has certain views, and his black friends from Philly, man, they call him an Oreo. They call him the N-word because he doesn't have the right views. And some people don't like that he married a white woman. And these views are not dead. They take on different form. But even as a simple example like this, do you guys remember Charlie Brown, right? What is it that Lucy called him when he would do something silly, or he tried to kick the ball and he'd make a dumb mistake? What did she call him?
Blockhead.
Do you know why that term blockhead came from? That term blockhead was used by some white Americans, even in Europe, to describe people of Germanic descent, people in Germany and other parts of that region of the world, because they had blockish features. Their head was more square, but it was considered, because of those features, that they were less intelligent. So when the Irish came, if you look at the early depictions of the Irish in New York and stuff, actually think of the what is it, from Notre Dame? Their little fighting Irish guy. He's got the big nose and the big chin. If you actually go back to the newspapers in the 1900s, that's almost the exact depiction that the racists used against the Irish to show them as big-nosed and short and all these sort of things. Those were racist images. It's just funny that they co-opted that. Now it's the logo for Irish. We're like, yeah, we own it. But that was actually racial imagery. So this is built into society in so many ways, and it's very, very troubling. Last quote from Barish. He said, while Barish expressed concern, now this is critical, his experiment could open the door to dehumanization of racism. He recognized, hey, when we try to do this human Z, it could lead to racism or dehumanization. But he believed hybridization experiments were an ethical mandate whereby, quote, the ultimate benefit of teaching human beings their true nature, that is, not special, not created, not valuable, if we teach them their true nature, would be worth the sacrifice paid by a few unfortunates. So if we had to sacrifice the life, if a few people had to suffer for the sake of humanity to prove that we're not these special people, then it's worth it. This kind of experiment is worth it. And this is not a fringe science dude. This is, the guy's still alive. He's, look him up. You can see his bio. Any questions as I close that section?
Yeah, but it's funny he didn't put his own sister in the cage with the gorilla.
No, yeah, of course not. Nobody, and that's actually insightful, and you probably know, but maybe even more than you know, because here's the point, and here's where the argument comes in. Even if we say it's not based on skin color, if the neo-Darwinian worldview has to make gradations of difference based on some sort of distinction, if it's not phenotypic distinctions of skin, then it's some sort of biological. Well, okay, sickle cell anemia, or what about people that are Down syndrome? There has to be a way. Look at the abortion industry, and the argument used for that is that, people are born, they'll be handicapped, they don't deserve to live, or they don't have the same value, they're lower in the value scale of human evolution. So what we've done today is we've changed who the object of derision is. So it's not blacks or Asians or whoever, it's not poor people that we put at the bottom, but it's still the same argument to use. There's another category of lower subhumans that aren't worthy of protection because they lack intrinsic sacredness. Does that make sense?
It does. And Dr. Joe, I was going to add, you're referring, when you're talking about, this isn't about like blonde hair, blue eye type of things. It's kind of what I try to, when I talk about race and things that help people understand, because even colorism, I can tell you that, you know, in the African American community, colorism is a huge deal. And you're talking about features such as darker skin tone, wider nose, bigger lips. These have traditionally been seen as unfavorable traits within within blacks. And so
even today, right?
even
That's not
today, I
old,
still
right?
feel
That's
about,
not like, that's not history. I
no,
mean, you can, I mean,
no,
exemplify that if you want. I mean, but you're not talking about something that was, oh, that's ages ago. This
no.
is today.
Yeah, it's like my life. Yeah. I mean, that's most of the issues I've had with race is within my own community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even in the
That's
Hispanic culture, it's like that as well. I mean, in the Hispanic, they don't really talk about it, but if you look at, because I'm Puerto Rican and Peruvian, so even in the Hispanic culture, I have seen other Hispanics, you know, like, so when they call someone like a sign of endurement is, you know, calling someone negra. Or, you know, or if you look at novelas, or if you look at like the Weather Channel or whatever, or, you know, they're typically on the lighter skin, and being darker skin is more looked down upon. And so, like, you know, they and I've seen some families, they would you know, even make fun of, you know, someone who is darker skin. And it's kind of, they don't really talk, they don't say it, like Hispanic cultures won't really say it, they don't really say it to other people, but it's there, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's prevalent in every culture. Matter of fact, I could share with you guys some research. There's some new research coming out how neo-Darwinian thought came to South Korea, and a lot of the exceptionalism that you find in South Korean culture was taken in Japan. It came in there as well. This idea that we're higher on the evolutionary scale than the other races is not exclusive to whites or anything like that. That's really key for the Christian to understand. My pointing this out, I'm going from the more obvious part of the history. You know, it was whites discriminating against because we're on the other. But you can look at every culture and you can find where they've done it to themselves. And Darwinian theory has been used as a justification. It didn't invent it. I mean, everybody, I believe, has a sin nature that lends us to, you know, some sort of prejudice. But it certainly institutionalized it, and it gave justification for those things. And for many people, it became a persuasive element to advance their racism. And so it's not just Western civilization. It's Asians, it's Eastern countries, it's African countries. I mean, this exists around. It's a global thing, and that's important to know.
I think even among the white people, and this is probably everybody, you know, there's some features it's kind of being looked down at, like obesity. You know, when a person is fat, no matter what race you are, it's kind of like, oh, this must be inferior characteristic of your body.
Yeah.
This is an inferior gene. I mean, that's prominent in American society, the white culture.
Yeah. Oh, I watched an old episode of Survivor with my son the other day, and it was interesting because there was a kid that was on there, and he was the relative of a previous player who'd been on that everybody hated because he was a cheater and he was just horrible and they didn't like him. And this one girl in one of her side interviews, I just heard it actually yesterday, and it made me think of this very presentation. And it's just how prevalent this is in our language. This is why this is so important to see how ingrained this is. She, on an interview, said, yeah, he's trying to be a nice guy and he's talking about this, but his last name was Hans. And she's like, if you're a Hans, always a Hans, it's in the blood. Do you even, that expression, it's in the blood, I mean, it actually predates the idea of genetics, but it used to be thought that blood was what carried through these traits from generation to generation. But this idea that he can't escape being a jerk like his cousin because he's genetically predisposed to being a bad guy. That was her view of that. And she doesn't even probably realize the history behind that and the worldview. That's why I say, well, that's why worldviews are so powerful. We often don't even know they exist. But she bought into the storytelling, and it doesn't matter what facts have changed. She's presenting one of these very arguments that a eugenist would have used. They use it clearly. They said, if you had parents who were in poverty, it was assumed the kids were going to be of also low birth and also bound to poverty, and they tried to isolate them so they couldn't marry rich people. Whether you were black or white, it didn't matter. If you were poor, you had a genetic inferiority. And they had contests back in the day with awards for the most fit families. And, it was crazy. But that's exactly the thinking that still exists in the way we look at our world.
Isn't that just another way of saying the apple doesn't fall far from the tree?
Yeah, but at least that doesn't tie it to a genetic Darwinian thing. And maybe you could argue that some people it's not
It's the
caught, not
family.
taught,
It's
maybe.
the family culture. It's the way they were taught.
Well, true, and you could say
it's the
that
way they all
the apple
thought
gets
about
its
things.
yeah, the apple is from a tree. So if you have a red apple come from red tree, trees that produce red apples, you don't get. Yeah, so actually, it might actually be more of that. Actually, true. It might be more than I was even thinking.
Biblical's, saying, a good tree doesn't produce bad fruit, etc.
Yeah, but of course that predates Darwin, so it couldn't have been. It might be compatible with the Darwinian theory, but it had a different philosophy behind it. It was just an agrarian society, good trees don't produce, bad fruit, bad trees produce bad fruit kind of thing. That's just, an observation it wasn't trying to make a philosophical statement of genetics and humans and stuff. It was just saying, hey, you guys all know, because you're farmers, you see this. That's a different intent behind the statement. And so we have to be careful not to impose, a wrong worldview on that, right? So even though may even use the same illustration, the same fact, they might be telling a different story with it. So that's where worldview, story, and fact have to come into play. We have to be cautious about that. But that's, it still has some connection worth discussing. It's good point though. So, Jane, I don't know. I want to get to the theistic side of this, and I think I could cover at least the broad scope of this argument in the last little bit. But I hope I will hope there's been enough engagement, because I know you really wanted me to have Q&A. Do you want to pause here and just do all Q&A? Do you want to finish this? Have we had enough engagement? I don't know where you guys are at. It's up to you guys. I'll do whatever Jane or you guys want to do.
You guys want to keep going on with the presentation, or do you guys just want to do Q&A now?
Keep going.
Going, yeah.
Okay, keep going, Joe.
All right, I'll take it.
I mean, also tell me we're kind of asking kind of the questions as we go along as well, so it's kind of like we're kind of doing both a little bit.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I just want to make sure you guys had enough of that, enough opportunity. I don't want to stop that, because I love it. I love this sort of dialogic format where share ideas and critique. It's fun. All right, let me get to this last part: theistic evolution and the problem of emergent personhood. Now, this is where I'm going to have to get into some philosophy. I'm going to try to avoid as much of the philosophy of mind, body, soul kind of things. And this is, guys like J.P. Moreland get into the huge mind, body kind of thought. I mean, there's huge volumes on this stuff, okay? So I have to say up front, I'm boiling this down for this presentation, even to the work I've done, because I have to try to make it fairly simple to just get the thrust of my argument. And unfortunately, I don't think I can hopefully I can be persuasive in it, even if I can't fully back up why I'm saying what I am. So I'll say that to lead in. So let me give you this little thing that I have here. So what is an emergent property? This is a question that I kind of want to look at. I have to kind of define this one term. So it's used to describe things in philosophy, but also other areas of thinking. But here's an example from science that I like. Hydrogen, H, is not wet. Oxygen, O, there shouldn't be the end parenthesis there, that's a typo, is not wet. But H2O in its liquid form, water, is wet, right? So wetness is an emergent property of H2O, but it's not a property that is inherent to H or inherent to O, or even H2O in its, frozen form or vapor form. Really, it's only when, you've put steam over your arm, only as it begins to turn back to a liquid form is it wet again. So wetness is an emergent property of H2O in its liquid form. Is that a simple enough example to define what emergent means? So two separate things exist. Only when they come together does a new thing exist, right? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. So here's what I want to look at. Oh, sorry. Zoom does this. If I click off the slide, it won't. There you go. So theistic evolution and this idea of emergent personhood. So what does that mean when I talk about emergent personhood? So theistic evolution, this idea that God guided Darwin's process, right? So Darwin's the science, God is the ultimate explanation. Okay, to some degree. Some people, allow for more miraculous intervention. Some people say that there's none at all, sort of a deist thing where God created and then just stepped back completely. Some say, no, he probably did this or that. It doesn't matter. Those are all just argument about the details. It's the idea that somehow God and evolution are this compatible ideas. Creation and evolution work together. So theistic evolution describes a spectrum of monogenistic theories with underlying commonalities. So that's what I want to get is they're all monogenistic in their form. That all humans started at some form, one ancestral group, right? But they argue differently about, there's some commonalities despite those things. All of theistic evolutionist people will accept that on some level, human personhood is a naturally emerging property tied to biological evolution through natural selection. So in other words, there's natural selection and there's other mechanisms, the Darwinian synthesis. I'm not trying to be too scientific here. So fill in the blank through natural selection, through neo-Darwinian mechanism, whatever you choose, whatever is in vogue today, doesn't matter. Actually, it doesn't change the argument. It doesn't change the worldview. It doesn't change the story they're telling. So, but at some level, human personhood emerged as enough molecule came into position in the right place and biological systems of the brain functioning with organs and heart and body, and boom, humans came into being through this process of evolution, right? Okay. So they also accept that neo-Darwinian biology provides the most reliable hermeneutic for understanding humans. By that is they say what Darwin tells us of how we got here. We evolved, and I'm going to use that to reinterpret the book of Genesis. That's the most reliable hermeneutic, not what Paul said or what Jesus said. We can change what they have to say based on, well, they understood it this way, but they weren't speaking scientifically. There's all kinds of reasons for that. But ultimately, whatever their justification is, they all say that, look, we need to reframe the story of Genesis, the idea of human origins and Adam and Eve as historical, real people. That has to go to the wayside because we must have a view that allows for humans to evolve over millions and billions of years into the present forms where personhood emerged as an emergent property of biological evolution. Okay? So is everybody with me so far? I mean, is that what I'm saying, at least? Even if you may not disagree, or you can have questions, that's good. At least my argument makes sense for where I'm at, right? Okay.
I'm going to step in.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I can.
Yeah.
No, yeah. I can't see everybody's faces, so you either have to just chime in
I'll tell you what. Hold
whatever.
on.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, yeah, there you go. All right. My undergraduate degree is in biology. And I think one of the problems that arises is that what most paleontologists or anthropologists would declare a human is a bipedal hominid, and you can go back hundreds, thousands, millions of years, whatever. But I think there are a lot of people who fall under the broad spectrum of theological evolution who say that human personhood didn't emerge biologically, but supernaturally. And what someone would call, what some biologists even would call a human would be that bipedal Neanderthal, Australopithecine, Java man, whatever you want to go back to.
Yeah.
But I think a biblical theologist, theological evolutionist would say that no, man wasn't man until 6,000 years ago, when God breathed into the nostrils of some kind of hominid and he became a living soul.
Yes. And so let me give the short answer to why I don't think that argument gets out of what I'm saying here. And I probably can't sustain this, but I'm more than happy to have a conversation outside this with you. But what I've kind of looked at is, if you look at the people who are writing those theological works, they still have to explain, okay, even if it was a population base of 10,000 hominids and God said he picked 2 and called them Adam and Eve and he breathed into them sort of their soulish aspect. they'll still say, well, why did he pick those two? Well, there's something about that population base of 10,000. They evolved to a certain level where they had some sort of consciousness. So they'll start using other words. They'll have some sort of moral awareness. So they still have to have some emergent consciousness. So they'll get away from, soul. They won't use soul. Well, God put the soul in once they had, consciousness or awareness. And this is where the literature gets really mushy because people all use different words, and the same word, they mean them differently. It gets very difficult to track down. That's why I have to kind of.
And that's what I'm saying.
Really
yeah. Even among scientists, yes.
So yeah, exactly. And so, but the problem they're going to have is that personhood still is an emerging property, even if you impose a divine intervention. I think they can't escape that fully. I think the second problem they have goes outside of this discussion, but I think the second problem is they have is, well, why did evolution happen to begin? Why did you accept it to begin with? And so you get it starts to create this sort of domino effect of what they're even arguing for to begin with. If the idea that God didn't create, so if God didn't do miracles, why is it okay he did a miracle of breathing the soul? So so you can't exclude miracles and then call upon them as an ad hoc way to rescue your theory.
Well,
so I guess
Joe, real quick.
No, that's not.
Real quick. There's a distinction I'm worried you're not making because it would support Eric's sort of rebuttal.
Okay.
There's a distinction between when you're talking about properties that are emergent. There's a couple of different kinds. There's a structurally emergent property and a sui generis emergent property. Sure. And if you have a structural emergence, which is what the neo-Darwinist would claim, that the structure of this is the phenotypical and genetic could kind of be traced all the way back down to the structure of an amoeba, and the structure can build, and it's simply a physical structure. But a sui generis property, emergent property, like Thomists believe about the soul, and Aristotelians and other people like J.P. Moreland actually believe about the soul, is that you have, Bill Hasker would believe that about the soul. Basically, it's a sui generis emergent property. Well, they would believe the form is there, but form would be inherent in matter. So it would be something to the effect of sui generis is going to be a very different sort of emergence.
No. Yeah, that's not right.
Well, yeah. Well, the point is, I think what Eric is trying to say is that you can have different types of emergence, and one could be considered miraculous. The other could never have come about in a natural, only from the pressures of natural selection and phenotypical and genotypical sort of
Sure.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I guess what I'd say is that, yes, people, because of how they're going to define emergentism, and I mean, if you have a room full of 100 theologians, you get 100 views, and you have a room full of 100 philosophers, you probably get 200. So, it's nailing all this stuff down is very challenging, because everybody's going to have a way around something. I can only kind of give you my broad conclusions on that, but Eric, I'm not trying to dismiss what you're saying. I'm just trying to give the thumbnail sketch of why I ultimately don't think it works, but I can't, obviously address the details of, we could get into, but I actually am more than happy to talk to you outside and maybe some of those other things where you feel like they don't fit. I just worry about going too deep into the woods if and losing other people who haven't studied.
I agree. And I'd love to talk to you on the side. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't mean to be dismissive in that at all. I'm just trying to make sure I'm not losing two people in the weeds of that, if that's okay with you. So, but yeah, let's please chat with that. But I still think, after reading what I've read and studying, I think that this idea of human personhood as an emergent property, despite the nuance that people bring in, I think we can't get outside of that idea that when we're marrying theism with neo-Darwinian thought. And I think the other commonality is that reject person has as a de novo act of divine creation, and human as a unique creation of God. So, and here's where I would say for that, especially if you're a Thomist or in Moreland's case, a Thomistic-Like Dualism, and I'll point this out in a minute. I think their idea of where the human form came from is completely the opposite. So in other words, in Neo-Darwinian, the human form comes first, and then the soul is implanted to somehow marry this evolved thing that has some worth in it that makes it human and others. But then you're still left with the problem of who didn't have the soul put in them, or who didn't have personhood, and were they still interbreeding, and what are the issues there? there's a host of other issues that come in, I think, that make that argument not work. I just don't, it's just distracting from this focus where I want to keep it, at least right now. So I'm not going to look at this chart. I actually have when I do my ethics class, I go over this whole thing and talk about these different viewpoints. And this is where we get lost in the weeds if I spend any real time in here. I just want to give you, there's really a few key categories, at least on this page. There's two options here. There's one on another page I'll show you. There's property dualism, and then there's substance dualism. Most people are familiar with Thomism, and others are familiar with Cartesian dualism. Cartesian dualism is usually what's used when people are trying to get rid of dualism as a thing, and they're not really arguing against Thomistic dualism. Two separate things. But property dualism, also known as actually emergentism. A guy like John Stuart Mill, I like to include him because people don't realize that, one of these founding father kind of things. It's actually interesting when you get into his political philosophy, how his property dualism and his view of humanity entered into his assumptions about political philosophy. It's interesting stuff. Anyway, at least to me. But the point I want to make is, for personhood, for a property dualist, essentially boils down to this: the absence of emergent the absence of emergent mental capacities indicates the absence of personhood. So if you don't have a certain set of emergent mental capacities, then personhood ceases to exist. And that's why you can get somebody, when you get into ethics, about if somebody's in a persistent vegetative state, or what happens if somebody's brain dead. Do they cease? When do they become a person? When do they cease to be a person? And so this is a live option among many Christian, well, I don't know about many, but several important Christian philosophers. So this idea of property dualism and emergentism, there's some who hold this idea, and that's how personhood is essentially defined. The only other one I'm going to bring out here is Thomistic dualism, which I think is still essentially where Moreland comes down, although he calls it Thomistic-Like Dualism. And so from Moreland, let's see if I can read it here. He says, basically in that, person is a hierarchical unity of capacities that guarantee personhood. Now, what's critical to that when we look at evolution and theories about that is that what for Moreland is, or for Thomism and Moreland specifically, is that yes, there are differences, capacities of mental capacities of, people change and do all the time, but because personhood is tied back to the non-material form of being, whether it's the soul or mind. However, again, people use those terms differently, and I don't want to get into that part because that's a whole other thing. But however you want to call it, mind or soul or spirit, those sort of things, that guarantees personhood to the individual. But it doesn't. But there's a hierarchical unity to those capacities that are still a part of that, what it means to be a person. And then the last thing I'll point out here is in the idea of substance dualism. I won't get into Spinoza, which is reductive, or sort of reductive physicalism, also calls panpsychism, which is making a resurgence, or pantheism, as some people call it. But the one I want to look at here, which is also a live option amongst Christian philosophers, Nancy Murphy being one, not Nancy Pearcey, Nancy Murphy. She's a non-reductive emergentist. And so for her, a material yet biological interactive emergent property, personhood is a material yet biological interactive emergent property between biological environment and social systems. So what does she mean by that? And then we'll get to questions, because this is probably all as clear as mud if you don't study this. So here's what so here's my argument, and then I'll give a quote from Pearcey of how I'm pulling these together. So whether you are property dualists, like we saw in Mill, or whether you're an emergent, and that sort of emergentism, or whether personhood emerges on the Nancy Murphy side, they have both unique arguments they take. In my reading of them, this is my take. I think this argument works. So premise one, evolving biological systems are the natural explanation for human personhood. In other words, evolving systems are connected as an explanatory purpose behind human personhood. And if you at least read those two, this is a part of what they write. This is a part of their argument. Both of them would include this in their argument, even though they have other philosophical explanations for human personhood itself. but they both would fall within this. And the second premise of this argument is evolving biological systems are indeterminate. I mean, that's just a neo-Darwinian thing. No biological system is set, right? It's always evolving based on environmental conditions and based on whatever other mechanisms of evolution there are. No biological system is determinate. It's not fixed, right? So this is where I get to the conclusion. Therefore, human personhood is also indeterminate. So that's the framework of the argument that I'm actually working on. This is actually the crux of a lot of my thesis work that I'm working on. And I still have to establish it. And that's where I grant that I have a lot of work yet to do to make sure that I can sustain this. But that's the premise of that argument. So at least as that argument goes, and maybe we can get to the personhood. I have a quote from Piercy. Maybe I should have put it before this. I don't know. But that's the argument. Does the argument at least make sense what I'm doing? And if you want to push at it a little bit, that's helpful too.
I can poke at it.
Oh, sure, go for it.
Cool. What do you mean by indeterminate? Do you mean random?
No.
Okay.
I mean, you can't fix it. So in other words, if no evolving biological systems are, I mean, the evolution means always changing, right? So it's not fixed. In other words, what I mean by it, it's not fixed. It's not fixed in one set state. It's always changing. It may take millions of years or billions of years, but it's still always changing. That's why you get,
it's a weird phrasing. It's a weird phrasing because I feel like a determinist would be really on board with a lot of evolutionary theory, but indeterminate meaning that it couldn't be determined by, do you mean epistemologically it couldn't be determined by somebody?
I don't mean that kind of determinism. No, I don't mean that kind of determinism that you're thinking of in there.
Okay.
And that's it, again, if we had a longer framework, and that's actually a good question. I have to make sure that distinction is clear. I'm not talking about that kind of determinism. And this is where in philosophy it gets wild too, because people use the exact same word and mean radically different things. And you look at all the journal literature and it's like, wait, what does he mean by that? It gets clear as mud at times. Let me see if I can put a point on this, because I know our time's almost up, and maybe if it works out, I can always work with some of you guys off or come back sometime, and you guys can look at this stuff and we can talk just about this portion of it. I don't know. So I guess I would say that the problem I have with emergent personhood really comes down to this. If human personhood is grounded in biological evolution, which at least for the sake of Murphy and Hasker would be on the other side of that. For both of those people, because they tie personhood to the biological evolution system. Now, again, Eric might have some other things they're trying to get around this, I think, through, divine miracle of, certain things. I have other reasons that I don't think that works, but that's, I don't want to get too deep, but I grant that he has maybe some pushback there that is worth discussing. But if human personhood is grounded in biological evolution, then there can be no single definition of personhood, because the definition itself must change as both human organisms and scientific theories continue to evolve. And to make this case, actually, if you ever look at any transhumanist literature, people that are looking at what are the humans of the future, what are we going to evolve into, and the whole transhumanist movement, it's the idea that you can't define human as one thing. I mean, look at your science fiction movies, TVs, Star Trek, all those things. It's all about evolved form of what personhood really is. Human is one type of personhood, but personhood can evolve beyond humanity. So there's higher and lower forms of things. So this is the challenge we get if we're going to grant that the human version of personhood is tied to evolutionary systems, then the definition of what it means to be human itself is difficult to define. We may want to have a definition. So this is where I go. So therefore, the words human and person really become a transient and accidental property, describing only the current state of our biological condition, and confers no special moral status. And to this, I would point to Nancy Murphy, and what she writes. I think this is really critical. She says, I believe that humans are not particularly biologically or cognitively unique, nor do they possess a distinct normative substance or part, but they are nonetheless unique in the cosmos due to the fact that human beings stand in unique relationship with one another, with families, communities, and cultures. And so the challenge that what Murphy says then is human value or humanhood itself, human personhood itself is not defined by any biological distinctive, because we're all connected to the animal distinct, creatures and nature that came before us. Hasker would say something similar to this, only in his own way. But that for her, it's our capacity to relate. So because consciousness is an emergent property, in her words, and that's of her argument, it's that consciousness that allows us to relate in society that makes us capable and gives us value as humans. But maybe you can see the problem here is this, is that if my capacity, if my value, if what makes me uniquely human is predicated on my capacity to have relationship with others, with communities, and with culture, what happens to the mentally inferior? What happens to somebody who cannot relate in the same way? Well, do they not stand above other, or do they stand lower as human beings? So this opens up a whole set of problems, because human personhood is not tied to a distinctive moment of creation, but tied to this process of evolution. And that's the thing I would get. So we're at our end of our time. Maybe you guys can check out these. I summarized some of Moreland's arguments here, and why I think basically philosophically, some sort of Thomism, as Thomistic-Like substance dualism, I think is important. This idea that I pointed here: a dog with a missing leg is still a dog. A human with a disability is still a person. That's what uniquely within Thomism, I think you get that argument, and that's sustainable. In any kind of emergentism, you end up with something that says there is some distinctive, whatever they want to call it, and it's different for everybody. That's the challenge, that makes something uniquely not human when they have those things. And so you guys can check those out, and maybe in another one we can do that. And I think the idea that a clear human personhood, definition of human personhood, has to be built into this idea of biblical creation. And so the summary then is to say all humans, despite their genotypic or phenotypic distinctives, are both biological descendants and theological dependents of the first couple. All humans share in both the sacred nature of Adam and Eve and in their historical fall from grace. And I would say that all human persons share in the present hope of salvation in Jesus Christ, the second Adam, and in the eschatological promise of a bodily resurrection. And so in Galatians, this idea that there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, I think only takes meaning within the framework of biblical creation, and that's what gives it its unique value. I'll say this and I'll take questions, is I just posted a 4-part series of a short little paper or essay that I had put together on this whole topic. So if you go to my blog, morethancake.org, you could read all the stuff in today's argument I wasn't able to get to and all that other stuff. Glad to engage with that. I also have other short series that I've done on Neanderthals and all that sort of historical side of stuff, if you're interested in that. So I'll be glad to join in with you guys on those things. But we're at the top of the hour. I'm sorry we didn't do questions for this last one, but I'm willing, if Jane is, I'll at least take questions. And I'm sorry, like I said, I didn't want to rush too fast here, but I at least wanted to finish the argument, even if I couldn't engage as well as we did in prior parts.
Yeah, we could stay on as long as people have questions and you're willing to stay.
Sure. What else I got to do?
All right, guys, you could ask your questions.
I have a question. I'm sorry, I know I talk a lot, so I apologize. My question would be, so just thinking like in history, probably, and I was thinking particularly, this reminded me of like Mormonism, and how the early stages of Mormonism, there was this idea that Black people couldn't be saved unless they were slaves, or it was something like that. There was something like to that effect. And so I know that
Yeah.
I know that this idea of racism predated Darwinism. Now, was there any other like any other theory or thought? Like I was thinking like maybe like what's the what is the like any other like theory in history where kind of it was like caused more racism also, you know.
Yeah, if
prior to
you could Google,
Darwinism.
yeah, sure. You could Google a couple words and probably come up with a couple articles that, you know, would at least on a blog level give you some intro to these. But if you were to like Google like race, you know, history, black, white, and then Ham, you know, sons of Noah, those kind of keywords, you'd come up with some books and some blogs that talk about this. But yeah, essentially in Christian theology, there were theories that blacks were descended of the cursed race, and some would tie it to the sons of Noah. Others would do Cain and Abel, you know, or not Cain and Abel, but yeah, Cain because he was Cain because he was cursed, and you know they'll tie to these biblical curses. But the sons of Noah, I think, is the most prevalent of those that would come up, and then they talk about the curse that came on his son Ham, and so they became, for some reason, so goes the argument, that's the black races, and they have a biblical text to justify that.
Hey, Joe.
It's crazy. And then the only other one I'd throw out real quick, and then I'll throw one other theory was, if you look at guys like what is it, Bob Jones at Bob Jones University, his racism was quite different. He's a polygynist, which existed prior to Darwin's theory. This idea that there were different ancestral groups behind the races, and so I have trouble. I can't track down his view if it goes back, ties in any way to Darwin personally for him. But I know some people tied that view. Once Darwin came along, they glommed on and said, aha, here's the scientific justification for this theology I think that they already had, of different, you know, a theology of different origins. And to that, they tie it to the book of Acts that says, you know, that each nation has their boundaries that God has established. And then say, you know, well, hey, there's these different nations. There's Asians have theirs, and the black people have theirs, and the white people have their nations. And so they made those distinctions based on, you know, skin color. And then therefore they said, since God created these boundaries, we should never violate them. That's why we shouldn't marry outside the race. So those would be the two that I'd be familiar with.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
You said Ham was cursed. I don't think Ham.
Was it not Ham?
Well, it was Ham's. That. It was Ham's son, Canaan.
Yeah, Ham and Canaan, but it comes from Ham's line. Yeah, I think they call it. It was Canaan was cursed, but they tie it to, and I'm drawing a blank. It's been probably 20 years since I read this, but I think they tie it's like the Hamites or something. Ham's name is still used in it, in the theology of it, even though it's his son that was cursed.
Oh, that's right. He would serve his brothers.
Yeah, he would serve his brothers, and
because of his sin against
blacks were destined to be slaves, and
because of his sin against his father.
Yeah. Oh, the sin against the father. Maybe that's why it's tied to him, because he sinned against his father, is what I was thinking. Yeah, like I said, I haven't read that particular theology like in 20 years, but
I've got a theory on that. I'd like to talk to you about. I'm not here, but I'd like to talk to you about that. Funny you brought that up
after the show.
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
Whenever.
Yeah. Oh, anytime. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? So that last part was so fast. I apologize, but I'm at least glad you got to see it a little bit. You know.
Yeah. So I attend El Camino College and SMC, and they told me the proper term when you ask someone the question of their background, you say, what is your ethnicity? You don't say what is your racial background. And is it what is about race? What's about race being a social construct that's improper? So, why is it more proper to say what's your ethnicity, or like instead of people used to say like what's your racial background? Now it's not. It's like it's not proper anymore.
Sure. Part of the reason. Let me just define those very quickly. Those are two they mean two different things, but it's not, people use them as clear as mud. It's like one of those philosophical terms that people interchange them and they're not technically
Right.
interchangeable.
Right.
So race technically is nowadays refers to the social construct of how we view some sort of outward difference. So race could be based off of skin color. It could be based off other, like I said, phenotypical features like facial
It's
construct,
physical, so it's
eyes.
arbitrary.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So could be eye makeup, like I have, big wide ovally eyes, or, they're brown or they're blue, or, whatever it is that people point out, they say, oh, that's generally the things that are associated with race. And we believe, and it's argued today, it's a social construct, and that there's no biological connection to race, is how it's really strong that you have to believe that. Ethnicity refers usually to a unique cultural origin or nationality. So ethnicity generally is like there's a cultural distinctive. So like somebody who's ethnically, like if you say they're in Mexico, that's their ethnicity. They would point to maybe cultural distinctives about them.
But I think that's like
distinctives.
That's
generally how it breaks down.
I think physical aspects are important too. I mean, why do you throw that out?
Yeah, that's where it gets really difficult because, like for example, if somebody says in a lot of the UC systems, I know for sure, and some back east, a lot of schools say, if you say to somebody, "Oh, I don't see skin color," they say, "Well, that's racism because you're denying the reality of skin color." Yet, if we say that, "Oh, well, skin color is a real thing, it's not a cultural construct," then somehow that's also racist. So it's the problem with a lot of these viewpoints is that they change depending on who's making the argument, and they change based on the argument that's trying to be made. And it's very difficult to nail down what is permissible to say and what's not permissible to say.
It's controversial. It's controversial.
Yeah. It's
okay.
Very difficult.
Because they avoid that. They say now you just say, what's your ethnicity? And then it's like, they kind of like try to like resolve everything. Yeah,
because generally that's resolved again because ethnicity tends to be associated with cultural practices or cultural histories or even geographic origins. And so then in the minds of the people that are doing that, they think, oh, I can get away from making any differences of skin color, which is a type. But again, my point there goes earlier is for the Darwinist, they have to get away from any biological connection to racial distinctives, because if they acknowledge that there's a biological difference, then historically those differences lead to there's a gradation of value. Are you lower on the evolutionary scale or higher on the evolutionary scale? And so that's enhanced. So you have to make it cultural and not biological. For the Christian, if you believe your origins in Adam and Eve, it doesn't matter if I have a biological thing that makes somebody black or white or Asian or, whatever their, differences are. It doesn't matter if it makes us different, because we're still have our sacredness guaranteed by God. It's still given to us as a part of His special creation. So differences biologically, and because of the way Thomism works, is those differences don't change the inherent value or dignity of the person themselves. So a dog without a leg is still a dog. A human without an arm is still a human. A human who is black or white or Asian or whatever it is doesn't matter. Those are just secondary, non-essential differences, even though they could be legitimate differences. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
They don't detract from the value of human person.
Right. Right.
Unless you haven't been born yet.
Yeah. Well, that's again an evolution argument that Christians don't have to worry about, because so if human personhood is guaranteed at the moment, if it comes from sort of this soulish origin of God, this God designed soul from the moment of conception, it doesn't matter that the physical form is in a state of evolution, growing in maturity. It doesn't matter that they haven't displayed consciousness, or they can't make, reasonable arguments. It doesn't matter, because they still have full human rights because of the origins biblically and also philosophically.
So that racial topic kind of goes into the Darwinian aspect a little too much of like evolved and less evolved, and right?
Yeah.
Therefore,
I think it touches too much on the history of how it was used, and I think as a culture we want to get away from that.
Yeah.
That's the only way they have to escape without bringing in, that's where theists come in, and they'll bring in God to the equation to try to solve the problem.
UCLA really tried to liberalize their thinking and their teachings, and they reinforced what they said and taught with like facts and experiments of like equality and everything. We're all like equal,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about some of the larger trappings of your thesis. The one thing I'm worried about a lot of this is, like, it's funny that you're giving this talk today. I have 10 housemates, and I'm number 11, and like 6, 7 of them started just having a conversation about systemic racism, racial inequality in America. What's that look like? Why did it come out the way it did? And we were talking, and the one thing that I tend to bring this to is there's a lot of socioeconomic disparity. There's a lot of like it's rich and poor more than anything else, but there is racial components. The one thing that I worry about is the sort of the neo-Marxist sort of underpinnings with the way society is kind of carved up. That's the one thing I've been really focused on. But you took a different tack in your presentation by saying that it's more about like the Darwinistic sort of appeals to like this sort of neo-Darwin story about how like the scientific like human personage is not really special. Everything just kind of trickled out of common descent. The one thing I worry about with that is that it seems like it's pretty wide. Like if you say that, like, for instance, the neo-Darwinist story does support inequality, and it can comport very well with certain types of systemic racism. I don't know if you can do that. That seems a bit broad, because then, like, what happens if I take virtue ethics or something like that, and I say, well, people who have a eudaimonistic sort of view of ethics, you have an exemplar, and then you mimic them, and then you build virtue, they could end up coming out as like superior and kind of tip the scales to who's better than who. And it may not be phenotypical, but it may be something like that, and cause similar types of discrimination. So is it just the fact that like a worldview could entail certain type of discrimination that is problematic for you, or is it specifically some trappings of the Darwinist story that make it problematic?
Yeah, certainly there's other philosophical systems or other worldviews that could entail, or at least be a coherent, allow for a coherent argument to be made to justify that. That's why I'm trying to avoid the word that Darwinism entails racism. I think I could say that Darwinism entails some sort of gradation of value of human beings. I think now, whether we want to call that racism, it doesn't necessarily have to, because I think Darwinists today have found a way to get away from the racial side, but we still have this, discrimination against, that's why you got guys like Peter Singer who say, we should be able to kill a child up until the age of 2 or 3. Well, because he hasn't exhibited the full characteristics of personhood. He can't make full decisions.
Keeps on living on that score, by the way.
Yeah, I literally had somebody argue that with me on Twitter like 2 days ago. They don't have the qualities of full personhood. So sure, they got away from race, but still entailed within the Darwinian worldview is gradation of value, of what makes a human lesser or of greater value. And you can see that if you read transhumanist literature too. The transhumanists are way more honest about it though than Darwinists.
Worrisome. Like the one thing that is worrisome about a lot of that stuff is that like the intrinsic value is being removed from a lot of these sort of conversations, and they really can't prop it up without something like dualism to kind of help. The one thing I was just concerned, because your thesis seemed to indicate that Darwinism is the problem, and that if we can kind of move away from Darwinism, we can move away from larger features of like different features of racism. But if what you say is true about the sort of transhumanist arguments, and the sort of like the ability to kind of, let's move away from the phenotypical features and just go to, oh, well, let's make it ethnicity is the real thing, race is just a social construct. If you can sidestep things that easy, is it really the Darwinism that's doing the scary kind of discriminatory devaluing work? Or is it like what else is doing that?
Sure, that's a good question. So I guess I would say the answer is this. What they've done though is, that's why I argue, you know, when you are, is an argument coherent, is a worldview coherent? In other words, does it mesh together, right? So what I'm saying is that I think for the Darwinist who comes up with these other answers to those problems, what they're ultimately doing is they're rejecting a part of that worldview that they say they believe. And so what I think is they end up with they come up with what I'm concerned is an ad hoc solution where they're just pieced together, oh, because I don't like where this is taking me, I'll come up with a solution here. Okay, and if I don't like this, I'll find a solution there. So the question is, does that solution violate any of the other fundamental convictions or things that you say you hold to in that neo-Darwinian worldview? And I think that's where the conflict comes in and all those things. And I don't think that's sustainable for most of those people. And that's also the other part where I think it's easier to well, it's obviously easier that it doesn't entail racism, but it does. Darwin gives a worldview that is coherent with somebody that wants to promote racism. In other words, there's no argument inside a Darwinian worldview that you could use to reject racism. You have to make an appeal to outside of Darwin. But even then, Darwinists still will pick gradations of value of human beings. They just may not pick racism. So that's the problem that I have with that. And so I think that you may escape one form of it, but you're bound, I think, to another form of it at some point. So I'm choosing race because then that's the other side is, even if you escape, okay, I'm not a racist because I have this other excuse, there's still nothing within Darwin's idea that says I should be reconciled among those racial differences, that says I should love my neighbor, that they have moral value. Well, okay, I don't discriminate with them, but I just don't see them as value. I'm willing, like, Dawkins, those guys, they're willing to sacrifice some human beings for an experiment for the sake of other human beings.
Cool. No, I appreciate that. I wondered kind of, oh boy.
Yeah, those are great questions.
Sorry, something happened with my computer. No, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Hit me up after too if you want to connect. I have a couple things I've written. Some I've published, some I've not. I mean, some actually, like I've done some conferences presenting some of these things. Some I have a couple journal things that are coming out, but I also just have some of I've written and I posted on my blog, and some I've never put out yet. But I'd be glad to share with you some stuff on these other things that kind of all connect if you're interested in that. So let me know.
How can we reach out to you actually?
So I mean, obviously the site, it's actually says bookings on there, but it's my email address. My email address directly is Joe, or actually do my email is J.R. Miller. So J is in Joseph, R is in Robert, J.R. Miller at morethancake.org. So J.R. Miller at morethancake.org. Shoot me an email and we can connect anytime for anybody that wants to continue this. And I appreciate you guys' time and patience too. And I know I went through that last part super fast, and but I am glad I got to share at least the skeleton of what I was trying to get out there.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'll shoot you an email. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This was very informative. Like, my mind was blown, and I was just the first thing I thought was where in Revelation where it talks about all nations, and I particular, and this hit home for me because I speak to a lot of Hebrew Israelites, and I witnessed to a lot of Hebrew Israelites, and it's a very racist group, and so this was very, very interesting, and then it for me, it definitely opened my eyes to getting away from scripture, I guess. Just kind of, I feel like, just kind of when you're like, for example, like a lot of people getting away from the deity of Christ, when they get away from the deity of Christ, a lot of their theological doctrines and a lot of that stuff just kind of break down. And I feel like when you veer off of biblical truth, there's a lot of discrepancies. So that's what was my thoughts on. But thank you so much. I really appreciated this. I really enjoyed it a lot, and this was awesome. Thank you so much you've been awesome. Like, just you answering questions and you just kind of being so humble. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, you're welcome. I'm working through this argument. This is fresh, and I still don't know how solid it's going to be at the end, but I love to do this with you guys. It's awesome.
Just in closing question, in terms of the creation account and what the biblical worldview shows in the creation account and the equality of man in that, created in the image of God. So would you say that this is a well, I guess not an argument for the truthfulness of Christianity, but an argument for the ethics of Christianity,
exactly,
amongst other worldviews.
Yeah. So, I mean, just the side of my background is, man, I've been way overeducated in a lot of things. And, I did my undergrad in engineering. I have 3 master's degrees and a doctorate, and then I'm working on my second for the Ph.D. And so I've studied theology and all this other kind of stuff. And I love all those things. But right now, I really consider myself an ethicist in the focus that I want to take, because I think ethics is so critical. And so the reason I started with this is because I believe that race is still one of the most obviously difficult issues we face culturally. And I know that so many people, especially young Christians, feel that we have to be ashamed of biblical creation. We have to be ashamed of the idea that God made us male and female and put us in a garden. And, we get into issues of transgenderism, all this sort of sexual identity, and all these tie in so strongly. But that one doctrine of Adam and Eve really becomes a hinge point for so many of our controversies that are really about, do we trust the Bible, and do we trust the authority of God's word? And so I picked this issue of race because my goal is, if I can show that Christianity gives, I think, the most coherent answer, that maybe some people will be open to the gospel of Jesus Christ, because they'll see that we're not racist, we're not hateful. Matter of fact, we have the best argument not only against it, but for why we should love one another. And so that's my heart in that, and that's what I'm hoping I can sustain in an academic way.
That's great.
Well said.
That's great.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Joe, I have a question for you, and thank you. Good talk. On a very personal note, I'm curious your interest in this. Is there, and I know I don't want to leave it all night, but is there something that happened previously in your life, some experience that drew this topic?
One, I see it's fracturing the culture, but personally, I'll tell you what, my own background is interesting in this. When I was a student at Penn State, my sophomore year, I was in a dorm, and 2 of my best friends that year on my floor, were 2 black guys that down the hall. I can't remember their names. That's been a long time. I'm an old man now. But they were my best friends. We'd have, every Friday we ordered a pizza and we hung out in the room. And we didn't have things called cell phones back then, and there was no cable. So we actually just talked and hung out and did all these sort of things. So in the day and age, we would put rocks on, use rocks to carve messages and stuff. It was a long time ago. But we used to hang out. And both these guys pledged a black fraternity on campus. And, I started to notice, like, hey, we're not hanging out anymore. Oh, we're just busy. We're just busy doing our thing. But pretty soon they came and they told me that, you were actually the enemy. You can't be our friend because you're a white man. You're the devil. And I met other students that, even that long ago were saying, like, blacks can't be racist, only whites are racist. Because they define racism not by a condition of the heart, but by a structure of Western civilization that I'm the beneficiary of, and power structures, and they bought into those neo-Marxist things. And so I went through a lot. I've lost lots of friends, even Christian. I actually had somebody a few years ago, you remember a guy walked into a black church in, I think it was South Carolina, I can't remember, and he was a white dude, and he shot, I think, half dozen or a dozen worshipers.
Yeah, yeah.
And and I said on one of my posts, I said, I'm praying for my brothers and sisters in, South Carolina, and just praying, God's peace, and just a terrible, terrible thing. And I actually had a friend. It was actually, I was a youth pastor at a Chinese church years ago, and I've lost some friends. I had this friend, he went to a particular seminary that I won't mention, that buys into all this neo-Marxist stuff. They basically said, well, before you can call those people brothers and sisters, that you can't call them brothers and sisters because basically they're black and I'm white. And to do that diminishes their racial experience and who they are as black people. And I'm appropriating their culture and all the kind of buzzwords. And I'm like, dude, you were in my youth group, man. And but he went through an educational system that just drained him of the unity that we have in Jesus Christ. In terms of philosophy, race, it may be biological, but it's an accidental property. It's not essential to who we are. Now, it's not non-essential to our experience. It shapes our life. It has harmed some. It has helped others. And that's true. And that's why we can't avoid the things like, I don't like the idea of white privilege because it's a neo-Marxist term, but I do believe that there are systemic issues that have favored whites and harmed non-whites. But that isn't a neo-Marxist recognition. That's a recognition that even because the world is so sinful, we judge based on those secondary, non-essential qualities. To overcome that sort of systemic racism and institutionalized racism, the answer isn't equalizing power and harming one group to give something to another group. It's valuing the dignity and the inherent sacredness of each human being for who they are. And so, yeah, it's very personal to me because I've lost a lot over the years, and I wish I hadn't.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I don't want to.
Thank you for asking.
I don't want to keep you on the line. I am wondering where you would recommend.
I got a wife and 3 kids. Who cares? We're together every day.
I've got nothing. Okay. No, I've got nothing but time. I do wonder about how you kind of how you tie in the sort of neo-Marxist interpretations of this, because that's been my sort of like, yeah. Whenever I kind of think about this and trace out all the thoughts. I studied Hegel pretty heavily when I was an undergrad, and I know that Marx ripped off Hegel wholesale.
Yeah, the Hegelian dialectic is key to the Marxist world.
It's the whole thing.
Paradigm.
If he would have been in high school, it would have been plagiarism. Yeah. So, because I studied Hegel so heavily, I recognize the connection myself, and I always end up tracing it back to there. I was wondering how you kind of came to the conclusion that this is or how important the motivation is from the sort of neo-Marxist worldview in this world is, and where would you recommend somebody kind of delve into some research on this? Because I'm fascinated with it, but I'd like to pinpoint some material.
As far as digging into it, hit me up after. I've done a couple. Like I said, I've done some video shows with some colleagues over the last few years, and we touch on that here or there. I did an interview with Corey Miller, who's the president for Ratio Christi. He's written some stuff on that, so I know he's got a few resources. And I think, Jane, you have access. I think some of those are free off the Ratio Christi thing, aren't they? The one on neo-Marxism, I think that's free. But I know he's written another book that's related to that. I will tell you what, though, the real challenge is there's not a lot. There's some journal articles on this stuff, but there's not a lot that's written well on looking into the neo-Marxist underpinnings to a lot of the cultural things that we do. And for me, that's sort of like, I've studied it just a little bit on the side, and I know enough to be dangerous and to discuss it. And I can discuss it intelligently and all, but I haven't written anything specific, although I am, I should hit you up though. I actually have an article, a blog that I've been working on for a couple years. I just haven't written it, and it's the title of it is, it's not incendiary at all. So it's hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag All Lives Matter, and Hume's guillotine. And I think, looking at Hume's guillotine, I think it undermines the difference between those. It's really a worldview difference. Political stuff aside, and I'm not saying, I think there's those two groups, the Black Lives Matter and the hashtag All Lives Matter, they have a worldview difference, and I think a lot of it connects to what you're asking about. And it just, nobody's really looking into that because it's such an incendiary issue. And I have to be careful what I write on and what I publish on it, because it's just, I'm really always cautious to make sure that I have thought them through fully. But I think there's tons of room in a lot of the political movements today to look into what you're looking. And I actually be happy to discuss some of this more with you offline, but you may be wiser than I am in some of the details.
No, I appreciate you. Thanks for your time. This is a good topic. I'm glad you're like kind of piercing into the onion of this.
Yeah.
Because I think that there's a lot of really, really important things that aren't discussed because it's hard to talk about, and people don't do their research, and there's a lot of off the cuff stuff that people put out there, and it's a shame because there's a lot.
Which is the name of my web show, Off the Cuff.
Off the cuff. I just know there's a lot of misinformation, and it's sad because it can be so hurtful and so difficult for people in situations to
absolutely
be othered and alienated in their own country or their own their own communities, and yet we don't have a cogent narrative for why or how, like why it's done or how to fix it, and you've got all kinds of conflicting details, and it really is frustrating.
That's the hardest part about the argument that I'm working for, and it's going to be my entire PhD work. I mean, there isn't an argument out there that's looking at the overall coherence. What is the most coherent thing? And I'm trying to tie together philosophy, theology, philosophy of Mahdi Bine, tie together biology in terms of evolutionary theories and human biology, and Christian theology into one single argument. And that's why I argue for the coherent side. I think you could have Christians who have theology right, but have their biology, one of those other pieces wrong. But I want to make a coherent biblical argument that addresses all of those critical components, because that's what's missing. And so you're exactly right. And there's not enough of this. And I think the neo-Marxist thing that you're in, critical, huge issue that it does tie into mine. I just wish I had more time to, maybe that'll be my next research project, to see how it ties into the Darwin thing. But there's a lot of room there for study and actually writing. So I'd encourage you, if you're not know where you're going academically, that's a whole open field. And you could actually probably get a good degree from a secular institution and write enough about, neo-Marxism without even talking about your Christian beliefs, and just be an expert in that topic. There's so much room to write about it.
Each other a little bit more, but that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. But I just mean, it's a great topic. So, yeah.
I just want to say, watching this made me appreciate more, just as far as a Christian, in Galatians, where it says we're Abraham's seed and that we're adopted into, God's family. And so, yeah, thank you. I overall just appreciated that, for sure, that we're all of Abraham's seed, and that, we are all adopted in God's family through Christ. And, it's just an amazing thing. Like you said, there's no Jew or Gentile, female, non-female. It's just we're all one in Christ, and we're all equal in value. And so
we all came from Noah, right?
All of us eventually go back that way somewhere. And then Adam and Eve before that,
Noah,
so,
Adam and Eve.
You're welcome. God is good. If you got something good out of it, then praise God, man. I'm glad.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, all right. I'm an East Coaster, so.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on and spending time with us on the East Coast. Oh yeah, the couple. See, the East Coast people are hanging in, because we're tough on the East Coast, man.
We are tough.
I tell my sons, no games, man. I tell my sons, man, you're California soft. That's the problem.
I told you, Jane. I told you.
That's a
We're
thing.
supporting his ego over here. No.
Actually, the truth, I tell him seriously, I have no ego, because I am more than humbled by all sorts of things. I have to say nice things about myself because I have no ego, because no one else will say them. That's why I say them. That's the opposite.
All right, well, Joe, there's a whole bunch of comments here saying thank you, and it was a wonderful presentation. It was excellent, fantastic. We enjoyed it. So good job.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it. And Lord willing, and Jane willing, not that those two are synonymous, but in this case, close. Maybe I'll come back and join you guys someday, and when all the good speakers and the guys that are big name people come through, and then she runs out. She's like, "Who's going to come on when COVID's over and all those people won't come back to talk with you anymore? I'll still care. I'll still care. Remember that."
Well, you have more degrees than a lot of these famous people, so.
That's true. That's true. That and a nickel will get you a nickel.
How much student debt are you in? Oh my goodness, I can't imagine.
None. I have zero debt.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
I should get a degree for that. But I have all that education and zero debt. I should have a degree for that. And I've been in ministry for a lot of those years, and so I'm not exactly rich.
That's awesome. That's awesome. How do you, I'll probably ask you.
And
how
I've
you
been
did that
unemployed
another
for
time.
the last 8 months, and I still don't have any debt.
Wow, that's awesome.
I'm serious, and that's part of why I'm humble, because nobody wants to hire me anyway. I'm lame.
Wow.
Oh, anyway,
I think Jordan just asked you what bank did you rob?
Yes. Which banks did you rob?
None. God is just good, man. God is our provider. I'm telling you, God is good. I've also made smart decisions in what I chose to do, and I went to schools that weren't necessarily my ideal school or the dream thing, and I found ways that I could get some money from people who would scholarship stuff, or that they were just had lower costs involved.
Pick your brain on that.
Anybody can contact me anytime, man. Like I said, I got nothing else to do, so except talk to you guys. So you guys are the most important thing right now. So yeah, no, I do. I honestly, I mean, I really am pretty serious about that. That's why I'm doing the Ratio Christie thing with Jane, because you guys are important. I'll be dead. You guys are still going to be around, kicking around someday, and you're the next generation. You're the ones that are going to be taking Christ to the next generation, man. So you're the most important thing in my life, is making sure that you stand for Jesus and what you do. And that's legit.
Amen.
So, well, I appreciate it, you guys. I know East Coast folks are done. Thank you, Jane. I appreciate your time.